The Tigris flows like liquid shadow through the heart of Mesopotamia, winding its way past fields, ruins, and the echoes of forgotten civilizations. In the soft light of dawn, the river seems calm, almost mundane, but beneath its surface, it carries centuries of secrets. Secrets that no scholar, no traveler, and no king has fully understood. It is here, along these banks, that a city arose whose name is whispered in fragments of clay tablets, in cryptic inscriptions, and in the faint traces of memory that refuse to fade. Ashur. The name evokes little in the mind of most, yet for those who can read the silence of history, it was a kingdom that held sway over empires, shaping the world from the shadows. Imagine walking through the narrow streets of Ashur in its prime. Dust swirls around mud-brick walls, and the air is thick with the smoke of countless hearths and fires burning for unknown rituals. Merchants shout their wares in the morning market, their tongues full of exotic sounds and foreign names, while priests move silently between temples, their eyes scanning the crowds with intent that feels almost predatory. Soldiers, bronze-clad and restless, patrol the city's gates, their spears catching the first light of the sun. And above it all, the palace rises, a labyrinth of corridors and chambers, each one hiding whispers of ambition, fear, and power. Yet even in the grandeur, there is a sense of something withheld, a mystery that refuses to be spoken aloud. A knowledge so dangerous that it is safer to bury it under stone and sand. Ashur was small compared to Babylon or Nineveh, yet size alone could not measure the weight of its influence. From here, kings plotted, armies were commanded, and empires trembled. To outsiders, it might have seemed a minor city-state clinging to the Tigris like a leaf on water. But Ashur's strength lay in its shadows, in the unseen hands that guided its destiny, in the whispers that determined the rise and fall of rulers far beyond its walls. The city's architects, warriors, and scribes understood something fundamental: that true power often moves unseen, shaping the world quietly, patiently, and with a precision that outlasts the fleeting thunder of battle. The city's very name carries a duality, a secret meaning hidden in plain sight. Ashur was both a place and a god, a mortal city and a divine principle. To the people who lived here, the distinction may have blurred. Kings took their legitimacy from the god Ashur, whose gaze was said to stretch across the earth, punishing the wicked and blessing the devoted. Yet the god was not merely worshipped. He was wielded. Kings and priests alike invoked Ashur to justify conquest, to demand obedience, and to conceal acts that might otherwise stain their hands with shame. Faith in Ashur was a currency, a weapon, and a shield all at once. And it was through this divine veil that the city hid its greatest secret, that power could be absolute, but only if it remained hidden in shadow. The Tigris itself seems almost complicit in this secrecy, carrying the detritus of centuries downstream as if to shield Ashur from the eyes of history. Sediment buries walls and foundations, while floodwaters erase streets and bridges. Time becomes both ally and enemy, preserving fragments while obliterating context. For generations, travelers and conquerors passed by without understanding, seeing only a city of mudbrick and dust, unaware that they were walking past the beating heart of an empire that would one day dominate the ancient world. Even today, the river carries a quiet tension, as if the city's spirit still waits beneath the surface, biding its time until the world is ready to remember. Ashur's story begins in whispers, in names half forgotten and in fragments of clay tablets that scholars decipher with painstaking care. The earliest kings are mere shadows in the archaeological record, yet their ambitions are palpable. They carved canals and built walls, not merely to protect their people, but to announce their presence in a world where might and cunning defined survival. But even as they consolidated power, they understood that brute force alone could not preserve an empire. The most cunning kings relied on strategy, diplomacy, and secrecy, moving pieces on a board invisible to outsiders. Every alliance, every trade agreement, every military campaign was a thread in a vast tapestry whose pattern few could perceive, and fewer still could comprehend. And yet, for all its sophistication, Ashur was fragile. Empires rise and fall, and no city is immune to time, greed, or betrayal. The Tigris reminds us of this truth with every flood, every drought, every shift in its course. To rule from the shadows is to constantly balance power and peril, ambition and caution. One misstep, one exposed secret, one enemy too cunning could unravel decades of careful design. And so Ashur thrived not just through strength, but through subtlety, through the ability to manipulate not just armies, but ideas, beliefs, and the very perception of history itself. As the sun rises higher over the Tigris, the city takes on a glow that is both welcoming and sinister. The markets hum with life, children play along the riverbanks, and yet, beneath the surface, tension simmers. This is a city aware of its own power and of the dangers that accompany it. Every stone, every inscription, every ritual hints at a story carefully curated to control memory itself. Ashur was not just an empire of men. It was an empire of perception, a shadow that shaped the fates of those who lived under its influence and those who merely observed from afar. And so, as we look back across the millennia, the question remains: how did a city of whispers, of shadows, and of secrets shape the destiny of kings and empires? How did it forge an identity so powerful that even after its decline, its echoes ripple through the annals of history, hidden yet undeniable? To understand Ashur is to peer into the delicate interplay of power, faith, and human ambition. A story that begins with a river, a city, and a name whispered across time, awaiting rediscovery. Long before the mighty walls of Nineveh or the grandeur of Babylon captured the world's imagination, there was Ashur, a city often overlooked, a kingdom whose story lingers at the edges of history like a half-remembered dream. To most, it is a forgotten name, a whisper on a clay tablet, a footnote in the chronicles of kings far more famous. Yet in its own time, Ashur was anything but forgotten. It was a city that pulsed with life, ambition, and danger. A place where power was measured not only in armies but in secrets, alliances, and the subtle manipulation of fate itself. The earliest settlers arrived along the Tigris, drawn by fertile soil and the promise of water. They built crude homes from mud brick, dug canals to irrigate fields, and established temples to honor the gods who watched over them. It was humble beginnings by any measure, yet from these small beginnings emerged a city whose influence would ripple far beyond the riverbanks. Ashur was a place where survival demanded ingenuity, where every decision carried weight, and where the line between prosperity and ruin was razor-thin. Life in the city was a delicate balance. Farmers tended their fields, merchants bartered exotic goods, and craftsmen shaped tools and weapons with precision born of necessity. Yet beneath this everyday bustle, the pulse of ambition ran strong. Kings and elders understood that Ashur's survival depended not just on fertile land or trade routes, but on vision, cunning, and a willingness to embrace ruthlessness when required. They observed the rise and fall of neighboring kingdoms and learned that power often came not to the strongest, but to those who could see the future hidden in the present. The city's architecture reflected this duality of pragmatism and aspiration. Simple dwellings sat beside temples that reached toward the sky, asserting a presence both earthly and divine. The streets were narrow, twisting, and designed to confuse outsiders, as though the city itself was a living puzzle, protecting its secrets from the uninvited. Ashur's walls were modest compared to later fortifications, but they carried symbolism. A message that this was a place that could endure, a place whose people were clever enough to survive against the odds. Even in its earliest days, Ashur was defined by paradox. It was at once humble and ambitious, fragile and resilient, visible to the world and yet impenetrable. Its rulers were deeply aware that legacy mattered more than immediate glory. They carved their names into stone and clay, not only to honor their reigns, but to assert permanence in a world that often erased the accomplishments of the weak. Every temple built, every canal dug, every alliance formed was a statement. We are here, we matter, we endure. What set Ashur apart from its neighbors was an uncanny ability to adapt and survive, to turn circumstance into advantage. Floods that destroyed fields were harnessed to create new channels and reservoirs. Raids by hostile tribes were met not just with force but with diplomacy, subterfuge, and the occasional strategic retreat. The city's leaders learned early that power could be preserved not only through conquest but through patience, calculation, and the manipulation of perception. A king who appeared benevolent could be a master strategist. A priest who preached humility could wield influence over life and death. In Ashur, appearances were never just appearances, they were weapons. The people of Ashur were acutely aware that their city's story was fragile, that memory itself could be both a blessing and a curse. While other kingdoms sought fame and eternal recognition, Ashur thrived in shadows. Its victories were monumental yet understated, its defeats carefully obscured. And in this delicate interplay between visibility and secrecy, the city forged a reputation for cunning and resilience. It became a kingdom that could not be ignored, even when the world tried to forget it. Trade was the lifeblood of Ashur. From its bustling markets flowed not only goods, timber, metals, textiles, spices, but also ideas. Merchants brought news of distant lands, rumors of political upheaval, and fragments of knowledge that Ashur's leaders would use to their advantage. These exchanges allowed the city to punch above its weight, influencing neighboring kingdoms through commerce as effectively as through war. Every caravan that arrived with exotic wares was also a messenger of opportunity, a chance to manipulate events from behind the veil of everyday life. Yet for all its pragmatism, Ashur was also a place of ritual and belief. The people honored their gods with ceremony and devotion, but they also understood that faith could be a tool of power. Priests guided kings in matters of diplomacy, law, and warfare, ensuring that divine sanction supported every political maneuver. In Ashur, religion and strategy were intertwined, forming a web of influence that extended far beyond the city's walls. To outsiders, it seemed piety. To insiders, it was governance. Despite its brilliance, Ashur's history was never simple. The city experienced cycles of prosperity and peril, of expansion and contraction. Generations of rulers grappled with internal intrigue, external threats, and the ever-present challenge of survival. Betrayal was common, and alliances were fragile. Even the most loyal advisor could turn, and a single misjudgment could undo decades of careful planning. Yet through it all, Ashur endured, not because it was invincible, but because its people understood the subtle art of endurance, the quiet skill of moving in shadows while shaping the world in ways others could not see. And so, Ashur remains a kingdom defined by its elusiveness. To study it is to chase shadows, to piece together fragments of a story that refuses to be fully told. Its power was subtle, often invisible to the casual observer, yet undeniable in its consequences. The rise of later empires, the Assyrians, the Babylonians, and even distant dynasties, was built upon foundations laid here, in this overlooked city that mastered the art of survival and influence long before history granted it a name worthy of legend. The city that once thrived along the Tigris is now largely buried beneath sand and sediment. Its streets are gone, its temples lie in ruin, and yet its story whispers through time, waiting for those who listen closely. Ashur teaches us that power does not always announce itself with grandeur, that sometimes the greatest empires are those that work in silence, shaping destinies from behind the curtain. To understand Ashur is to confront the fragile, fleeting, yet enduring nature of human ambition, and to realize that some of the most profound forces in history operate quietly, leaving their mark in ways the world only gradually recognizes. In Ashur, the divine was never distant. It was intimate, immediate, and omnipresent. The city itself bore the name of a god, and from the earliest days, the people understood that their fate was intertwined with forces beyond their comprehension. The god Ashur was not merely a figure of worship but a principle of power, a presence that legitimized kings, sanctioned war, and demanded obedience. Temples dotted the cityscape, their mud-brick walls adorned with reliefs of winged deities, lions, and celestial symbols, each designed to remind citizens and visitors alike that this was a place where the sacred and the political were inseparable. Priests moved through Ashur streets with an authority that rivaled the king's. Their eyes, calm and calculating, seemed to see not just the present but the unfolding of events yet to come. Rituals were not idle gestures. They were carefully orchestrated performances, a subtle blend of faith and strategy. Sacrifices were made, not simply to appease gods but to shape perception, to convince the populace that the king's actions were divinely sanctioned, that every conquest, every law, and every punishment was not a choice of mortals but a decree of Ashur himself. In this city, belief was both armor and weapon, and those who wielded it understood its power more keenly than the soldiers who marched in the streets or the generals who planned campaigns beyond the city walls. The gods of Ashur were not singular in their influence. While Ashur remained supreme, a pantheon of lesser deities influenced daily life. Each temple specialized in aspects of existence: fertility, war, trade, and wisdom. Yet even these gods were instruments of human ambition. Kings consulted oracles and priests not merely to interpret divine will, but to ensure that their political and military strategies carried the aura of inevitability. A general who claimed the favor of a god did not merely fight for the throne. He fought for destiny itself. And in a world ruled by perception, that was the most powerful advantage of all. One of the city's most striking features was its integration of faith and fear. The people believed their gods could see their actions and intentions, yet the rulers knew that belief could be channeled. Laws were inscribed with references to divine wrath. Punishments were framed as punishments from the gods themselves. This fusion of religion and governance created a society where obedience was voluntary in appearance but compelled in reality. The city's power rested on this delicate manipulation of belief. A king who could convince his people that his will was divine could command loyalty far greater than what mere force could achieve. But the divine presence in Ashur was not merely a tool. It also inspired awe, reverence, and terror. Festivals illuminated the city with fires, drums, and chants that echoed across the Tigris. Citizens would gather in temple courtyards, watching as priests performed rites that seemed to blur the line between heaven and earth. It was a world alive with symbolism. Winged creatures carved into gates, celestial patterns painted on walls, lions representing both strength and ferocity. Every visual, every ritual, every word spoken was designed to evoke the sense that humans were part of a larger, unknowable order. A reminder that power was not just political but cosmic. Yet even as faith inspired devotion, it concealed the city's darker truths. Behind the walls of temples and palaces, secret councils met to decide the fates of nations. Prophecies were interpreted selectively, omens manipulated to serve the ambitions of the powerful. Kings appeared to act according to divine will, but in reality, they moved as pieces on a chessboard, guided by cunning advisors who understood that knowledge of belief could be as decisive as the sharpest sword. The god Ashur became both shield and sword, a divine figure whose authority legitimized the mortal ambitions that truly shaped the city's destiny. The connection between gods and kings also reinforced a culture of fear. Disobedience was not merely political defiance. It was sacrilege. Rebels, traitors, and even careless citizens could be punished under the guise of divine judgment. Tales of divine retribution circulated alongside stories of military conquest, reinforcing the notion that Ashur's power extended beyond mortal comprehension. Fear and reverence intertwined, creating a society that was disciplined, ambitious, and, in many ways, unyielding. Even Ashur's enemies felt this spiritual weight. Letters and inscriptions from neighboring kingdoms hint at awe and terror of the city's gods as much as of its armies. Envoys recorded not only military strength but reports of rituals, festivals, and oracular pronouncements that suggested an otherworldly force guided the city. To challenge Ashur was not only to challenge its soldiers but to challenge the will of gods themselves. And in a world where divine favor was believed to be decisive, this was a formidable reputation. Yet there was complexity, ambiguity, and subtlety beneath the surface piety. The god Ashur could be invoked to justify justice or cruelty, expansion or restraint, mercy or terror. Faith was flexible, adaptable, and often manipulated with precision. Priests, kings, and advisors knew that divine authority could be a lens through which reality itself could be interpreted, reshaped, and controlled. They understood that people would follow not merely orders, but the perception of inevitability, the belief that the world itself favored those in power. And in this, Ashur became more than a city or a kingdom. It became a masterclass in the orchestration of human belief. Perhaps the most enduring lesson of Ashur's faith was its subtlety. Power did not always arrive in banners and swords. Often, it came cloaked in ritual, prophecy, and divine sanction. To the outside observer, it appeared that the gods ruled, that kings obeyed divine will. But in truth, the city's human architects were the ones who pulled the strings, orchestrating ceremonies and manipulating belief to reinforce their control. The god Ashur, revered and feared, became inseparable from the city's identity, a constant reminder that power was as much a matter of perception as of action. And so, in the heart of the Tigris, the city thrived under divine shadow. It conquered, endured, and influenced, not merely through armies and walls, but through faith, fear, and the subtle mastery of human psychology. The gods of Ashur were more than celestial figures. They were instruments, shields, and mirrors of the ambitions of those who ruled the city. And in the silent spaces between rituals, sacrifices, and prayers, the greatest secret of all was revealed. That belief, carefully guided, could be the most powerful force of all. The first kings of Ashur were men who understood the fragile alchemy of ambition and survival. Their names are whispered through history, often only glimpsed in fragments of cuneiform inscriptions, yet their influence shaped centuries to come. These early rulers were not mere figureheads. They were architects of an empire built as much on strategy and perception as on conquest. They understood that the world beyond the Tigris was a complex web of alliances, rivalries, and shifting loyalties, and that to survive and to thrive, they would need to navigate it with both courage and cunning. Imagine a king walking through the narrow streets of Ashur, bronze sandals clinking on stone, attendants and guards flanking him as he surveys the bustling city. He sees merchants shouting across the market square, children playing along the riverbank, and soldiers drilling in the dust. Every gesture, every glance, every public appearance is calculated. In Ashur, visibility is power, but so too is the careful cultivation of secrecy. The early kings mastered the art of appearing humble in public while consolidating extraordinary influence behind closed doors. The people saw the ruler. Few saw the hand that guided the city's destiny in silence. These rulers were ambitious, often ruthlessly so. They waged war not merely to expand territory but to assert dominance, to secure resources, and to demonstrate that Ashur was a force the world could not ignore. Campaigns were meticulously planned, sometimes years in advance, with spies gathering intelligence, scouts charting terrain, and messengers carrying coded instructions to generals far from the city. Victories were celebrated with grand feasts, statues, and inscriptions carved into walls, ensuring that every citizen and every enemy understood the king's prowess. But behind the celebration lay a more calculating truth. The king's real power was not measured by the battles he won, but by the fear, loyalty, and influence he commanded even in times of peace. Ambition, however, brought danger. Rival families, jealous nobles, and scheming generals all posed threats to the throne. Assassination was a constant risk. Betrayal could come from those closest to the king. Early Ashurian kings learned quickly that trust was a rare commodity and that the loyalty of advisors and soldiers was often fleeting. In response, they developed elaborate systems of surveillance and reward, cultivating networks of spies, informants, and loyalists who ensured that no conspiracy could go unnoticed. Every smile, every conversation, every gesture could be both a signal and a warning. The palace was as much a theater of diplomacy and intrigue as it was a seat of governance. Yet for all their cunning, these kings were deeply human. They felt fear, desire, pride, and doubt. They worried for their families, mourned lost friends, and sometimes doubted their own judgments. Clay tablets and inscriptions hint at moments of hesitation, at decisions weighed not only in terms of strategy but in terms of morality and survival. The early kings were pioneers navigating a world where power could vanish as quickly as it was gained. Their humanity was both a strength and a vulnerability, shaping the decisions that would define the city's future. In addition to military prowess and political cunning, the first kings of Ashur were devoted to leaving a lasting legacy. They constructed canals and aqueducts, fortified walls and temples, ensuring that their names would endure long after they had passed. Every building, every statue, every inscription was a statement of permanence, a declaration that Ashur was not a transient settlement, but a city destined to shape the course of history. The ambition to endure was intertwined with ambition to expand, creating a dual drive that propelled the city from a modest riverside town into a kingdom of regional influence. But power in Ashur was never absolute. Even the most formidable kings faced challenges from natural disasters, famine, disease, and rebellion. The Tigris could flood, crops could fail, and rival cities could threaten with armies and alliances. The first rulers understood that the survival of their reign, and of Ashur itself, depended on a delicate balance between force, diplomacy, and the careful management of perception. It was not enough to rule. One had to appear invincible, even when uncertainty loomed at every horizon. The human stakes were profound. Kings waged war knowing that thousands would die, that families would be torn apart, and that the city itself could be imperiled. Their decisions carried consequences that stretched far beyond their own lives, shaping the destinies of entire generations. And yet, despite the weight of responsibility, they pressed forward, driven by ambition, fear, and the unrelenting desire to carve their mark upon history. In Ashur, greatness and tragedy were inseparable companions. The first kings also understood the symbolic power of ritual. Coronations, sacrifices, and public displays of devotion reinforced their authority. Every gesture was designed to merge human ambition with divine sanction. By aligning themselves with the god Ashur, they legitimized their actions, claiming that their victories and decisions were not merely human achievements but expressions of divine will. The fusion of religion and politics created a potent tool of control, ensuring that loyalty was both emotional and strategic. Even today, the names of these early rulers, though partially lost to time, resonate with a sense of enigma. Their achievements hint at a civilization far more sophisticated and cunning than history often credits. They reveal a world where ambition was inseparable from secrecy, where human ingenuity intertwined with faith, and where survival demanded not just strength, but subtlety and vision. The first kings of Ashur did more than rule. They laid the foundations of a shadow empire, one that would shape the future of Mesopotamia long after their reigns ended. As the Tigris winds its way past the ruins of Ashur, the echoes of these rulers still linger. Their victories, failures, fears, and ambitions whisper through the stones, the inscriptions, and the faint traces of walls long since crumbled. To understand Ashur is to confront the complexity of human ambition, the weight of power, and the fragile line between legacy and oblivion. The first kings set the stage, mastering both the visible and invisible forces of history, and in doing so, they ensured that Ashur would not simply be a city of mud and stone, but a kingdom whose shadow would reach across centuries. Ashur's rise was not only the product of kings and priests but also of stone, steel, and the relentless drive to survive and dominate. The city's walls were more than mere protection. They were statements of intent, monuments to power etched against the horizon. Crafted from mud brick and reinforced with timber, these fortifications wound around the city like a vigilant guardian, their height and thickness designed to dissuade both invaders and would-be rebels. From atop these walls, sentries could survey the fertile plains and winding canals, the veins of trade that fed the city, and the sparse hills where rival tribes plotted in the distance. Yet behind this appearance of strength lay a deeper truth. The walls were as much symbolic as practical. They announced to all who approached that Ashur was a city that would endure, that it was a kingdom not easily challenged, and that its rulers commanded not only armies but fear. The human cost of this security was staggering. Soldiers trained from youth to become instruments of the king's will, learning not only the arts of combat but the psychology of intimidation. They moved with precision, drilled to respond instantly to the changing tides of battle. Generals studied the terrain meticulously, understanding that rivers could be both lifelines and traps, that hills could conceal ambushes, and that the movements of a single unit could determine the outcome of a campaign. Every battle waged under Ashur's banner was preordained with strategy and brutality, yet it was also a theater, a display designed to impress allies and terrify enemies. Victory and fear were inseparable in Ashur, two sides of the same coin that maintained its dominance over the region. Ashur's armies were feared not only for their strength but for their innovation. Siege engines, chariots, and organized infantry formations gave them a tactical advantage few rivals could match. The city's generals understood that brute force alone would not secure an empire. Strategy, adaptability, and cunning were equally essential. They studied the weaknesses of enemies, exploited divisions among rival states, and often turned the landscape itself into a weapon. Campaigns were meticulously planned, with contingencies for every conceivable challenge, from river floods to sudden rebellions. Even the harshest winters or the heat of summer deserts could be weaponized against those unfamiliar with the terrain. Yet, for all its sophistication, Ashur's military might was inseparable from its culture of fear. Conquered cities were often given stark choices: submission and tribute or destruction. Those who resisted were documented in inscriptions and reliefs, their fates recorded in detail to serve as a warning to others. The propaganda of terror was as carefully cultivated as the armies themselves. Lions, winged bulls, and scenes of conquest adorned the city's walls, reinforcing the idea that Ashur's rulers were favored by the gods and that resistance was futile. To face Ashur in battle was to confront not only a disciplined army but an entire system designed to crush hope and command obedience. The city's strength, however, was not built solely on war. Ashur was also a master of diplomacy and subterfuge. Alliances were forged through marriage, trade, and promises of protection, while spies and informants ensured that even friendly territories could be monitored and manipulated. Every decision carried multiple layers of intent, designed to maximize advantage while minimizing risk. The early kings and their councils understood that power extended beyond the battlefield, that influence could be exerted through the perception of strength, through the careful management of information, and through the orchestration of fear. In Ashur, the psychological dimension of control was as critical as the physical one. The city's fortifications were often the stage for dramatic confrontations. Archaeological evidence suggests that Ashur experienced numerous sieges, some of which remain shrouded in mystery. Chroniclers recorded victories in glowing detail, but often glossed over defeats, leaving gaps in the historical record that hint at secrets and betrayals long buried. These sieges were not mere military engagements. They were tests of the city's resilience, ingenuity, and capacity for endurance. Stories passed down hint at citizens who dug tunnels beneath the walls, soldiers who held positions against impossible odds, and strategists who turned desperate situations into legendary triumphs. The lines between human courage, cruelty, and cunning blur in these tales, revealing the complex anatomy of a city built to endure. Ashur's walls were complemented by a network of roads, canals, and watchtowers that allowed the city to project power across the surrounding landscape. Rivers were diverted, bridges controlled, and communication maintained with near-impossible efficiency. In times of war, messages could travel swiftly from outlying garrisons to the city, allowing generals to respond to threats before they fully materialized. In times of peace, the same infrastructure supported trade, agriculture, and cultural exchange, ensuring that Ashur remained both a practical and symbolic center of influence. The city's ability to control movement, information, and resources was as critical to its dominance as the swords and spears of its soldiers. Despite this apparent invincibility, Ashur's strength was always precarious. History shows that empires are rarely defeated solely by external enemies. Internal decay, misjudgment, and betrayal are often more dangerous than any invading army. Kings who appeared secure could be undermined by rivals within their own courts. Generals could switch allegiance, priests could manipulate belief for their own ends, and the populace could revolt if the burdens of war and taxation became too great. Ashur's rulers understood this intimately, which is why they invested as much in intelligence, loyalty, and perception as in walls and weaponry. Every victory carried a lesson, and every loss taught a caution that would shape the city's policies for generations. Even in moments of peace, the city exuded tension. The soldiers patrolled the streets, and the citizens moved with a careful awareness of authority. Merchants conducted their business under the watchful eyes of tax collectors and informants, while the priests ensured that every ritual reinforced the king's supremacy and divine favor. Ashur's power was holistic, encompassing not only physical and military might but social, spiritual, and psychological control. It was an empire that dominated minds as effectively as it dominated territories. Through these walls, wars, and systems of control, Ashur became something more than a city-state. It became a symbol. To its citizens, it was a bastion of civilization and survival. To its enemies, it was a shadowy force that inspired both awe and terror. Its fortifications were not merely stone and brick. They were embodiments of ambition, determination, and human ingenuity. They were a testament to a civilization that understood, perhaps better than any of its contemporaries, that the endurance of power relies not only on what one can conquer but on what one can control, conceal, and command through fear, respect, and the artful shaping of perception. And so the walls of Ashur were never just defenses. They were statements, warnings, and monuments. They framed the city's identity and shaped its destiny. Every stone, every gate, every tower was part of a larger narrative. That Ashur was a kingdom built not only to survive but to dominate, to endure through both brilliance and terror, and to leave a shadow on history that even time could not fully erase. Power in Ashur was never as simple as the king's crown or the sword at a general's side. Behind the grand palace walls and the imposing city gates, there existed a network of unseen hands, advisors, spies, priests, and shadowy figures whose influence often surpassed that of the monarch himself. They were the city's silent architects, orchestrating strategy, manipulating perception, and ensuring that Ashur's pulse remained steady even in moments of turmoil. These were the individuals who understood the delicate interplay between fear, faith, and loyalty, and who could bend both the city and the region to their will without ever stepping into the light of public view. The Shadow Council, as some modern historians have come to call it, was a collection of minds that operated in the space between obedience and deception. Some were priests, wielding divine authority to guide kings and generals alike. Others were bureaucrats, managing resources, trade, and the subtle levers of civic life. There were also spies, embedded within the city and among its neighbors, gathering intelligence that could prevent disasters before they unfolded. Their work was invisible, yet the consequences of their decisions were profound. Wars could be won or lost, alliances formed or broken, entire cities reshaped, all according to the council's discreet hand. These advisors understood one principle above all: perception is power. A king's decree could not simply command. It had to appear inevitable, sanctioned by the gods, and reinforced by the city's intricate social and religious structures. A general's movements in the field were often dictated by secret intelligence, carefully curated to exploit enemy weakness or incite mistrust among rivals. Even the priests, who ostensibly served spiritual purposes, acted as intermediaries in political and military decisions. Through ritual, prophecy, and omens, they guided not only belief but action, ensuring that divine authority amplified human ambition rather than obstructing it. Yet the influence of the council was not without danger. Secrets, by their nature, could be turned against their wielders. An advisor who overstepped, a spy who betrayed confidence, or a priest whose vision contradicted the king's intentions could be removed or eliminated. The shadowy power that controlled Ashur required constant vigilance. Trust was earned and maintained through a mixture of fear, loyalty, and subtle coercion. Every word spoken, every gesture made, and every message delivered could carry a hidden meaning, signaling either alliance or betrayal. Life in this network was a game of perpetual caution, a world where brilliance and treachery were inseparable companions. The council's influence extended far beyond the city itself. Diplomacy, trade negotiations, and military campaigns often bore the fingerprints of these unseen hands. Ambassadors and envoys might believe they were dealing directly with kings, yet the decisions guiding negotiations were frequently the result of meticulous counsel, shadowed strategy, and the manipulation of information. Even Ashur's enemies were affected, unknowingly responding to plans that had been set in motion long before they appeared on the battlefield. In this way, Ashur extended its power quietly, asserting dominance without necessarily lifting a sword. One of the council's most remarkable tools was knowledge. Clay tablets, secret inscriptions, and coded messages allowed them to preserve intelligence, plan campaigns, and maintain surveillance with astonishing sophistication. Information flowed through networks that spanned the Tigris and beyond, reaching even remote outposts and allied cities. Messengers carried instructions that could alter the course of events hundreds of miles away, all without the public ever knowing. In a city that valued visibility and ritual, the unseen movements of the council remained deliberately concealed, ensuring that Ashur's true power was masked beneath layers of ceremony, faith, and spectacle. This hidden authority also extended into culture and belief. By guiding the interpretation of omens, the messaging of priests, and the rituals performed in the temples, the council could manipulate both citizens and rulers alike. A king might believe himself acting on divine instruction, yet his choices were subtly guided by advisors who understood both human nature and the machinery of belief. Religion became a tool, loyalty a currency, and secrecy the foundation upon which the empire's endurance rested. It was a power that could shape hearts, minds, and history itself, operating in a space where most would never even suspect its existence. The human stakes were immense. Those within the council were not merely strategists. They were custodians of the city's survival and architects of its destiny. Decisions made in shadow chambers could lead to the triumph of a campaign, the avoidance of disaster, or the downfall of an entire generation. Yet their work was largely invisible, acknowledged only through the ripple effects that shaped the lives of citizens, soldiers, and kings. They were both saviors and potential threats, respected, feared, and constantly scrutinized. Despite their influence, the council was not infallible. Ambition, envy, and personal agendas sometimes infiltrated decision-making, creating vulnerabilities that could be exploited by rivals within or outside the city. History hints at plots that were quietly suppressed, betrayals that went unnoticed until consequences erupted, and rival factions whose subtle power struggles threatened to destabilize the very foundation they were sworn to protect. Even the most disciplined members had to navigate these perils, balancing loyalty to the city with survival in a world where the wrong misstep could be fatal. Yet it was this very tension that gave Ashur its resilience. By distributing power through an intricate web of influence, rather than relying solely on the king, the city ensured that knowledge, strategy, and foresight were never concentrated in a single point of failure. This network allowed Ashur to anticipate threats, respond with precision, and endure crises that might have destroyed lesser kingdoms. The council's shadow became the city's hidden backbone, a force that, though invisible, was more potent than walls, armies, or temples. Even as centuries passed and kings rose and fell, the legacy of this hidden network endured. The rulers who followed inherited not only thrones but systems of intelligence, ritual guidance, and subtle influence that had been cultivated for generations. The Shadow Council was not merely a feature of one reign. It was a defining characteristic of Ashur itself, shaping the city's destiny and extending its influence far beyond what the casual observer might perceive. In the end, Ashur's greatest strength was not the sword, the chariot, or the walls. It was the invisible hand that moved quietly behind them. This network of shadow advisors, spies, and priests was the engine of strategy, the arbiter of destiny, and the silent guardian of a city that understood that true power often flourishes in silence. To rule in Ashur was to see and manipulate what others could not, to act in shadows while projecting the appearance of divinely sanctioned authority. And it was this mastery of the unseen that allowed Ashur not only to endure but to dominate, leaving a legacy that continues to intrigue, mystify, and inspire centuries later. The wealth of Ashur was not merely measured in conquered lands or tributes from vassals. It was carried along the arteries of trade, flowing through the city like a river of gold, silver, spices, and exotic goods. Its merchants were more than traders. They were the lifeblood of the kingdom, connecting the city to distant lands, cultures, and ideas. Caravans set out at dawn, laden with timber, metals, textiles, and precious stones, while returning with goods unseen in the Mesopotamian heartlands. Copper from Anatolia, lapis lazuli from the mountains of distant Afghanistan, cedar from Lebanon. Each transaction was not just commerce. It was an instrument of influence, a silent message that Ashur's reach extended far beyond its city walls. The city's markets were a theater of wealth, ambition, and subtle intimidation. Merchants called across the streets, displaying wares and negotiating prices with a blend of persuasion and calculated threat. Buyers navigated the chaos with skill, understanding that behind every gesture and every word was a potential maneuver of dominance. The city itself was organized to maximize both control and profit. Canals facilitated transport, granaries stored surplus for times of scarcity, and warehouses lined the riverbanks, guarding the treasures that gave Ashur both sustenance and leverage. In a society where trade was tied to politics, every coin and shipment carried significance far beyond mere value. Ashur's economic power was inseparable from its military and political might. Wealth funded armies, built walls, and sustained alliances, allowing the city to project influence that often exceeded its modest size. Tribute from neighboring states supplemented the coffers, but it was Ashur's ability to control trade routes that gave it real leverage. Caravans crossing its territory were monitored, taxed, and sometimes redirected to serve the city's strategic interests. A merchant's route was not just a path of commerce. It was a thread in a web of control that allowed Ashur to anticipate rivals' movements, disrupt enemies' supply lines, and consolidate power quietly, far from the battlefield. Yet the city's prosperity was as fragile as it was dazzling. The Tigris, the same river that nurtured life, could also bring disaster. Floods washed away crops, altered trade routes, and destroyed infrastructure. Droughts threatened the granaries and forced careful rationing. Even the most sophisticated economic networks could not withstand the whims of nature entirely, and Ashur's leaders understood that wealth was always provisional, requiring constant vigilance, foresight, and adaptation. Merchants, soldiers, and administrators alike learned to operate in a delicate balance between opportunity and risk, guided by both pragmatism and faith. Religious institutions were also deeply entwined with the city's economy. Temples owned land, collected tithes, and controlled large portions of production and distribution. Priests often acted as economic advisors, influencing which trades were encouraged, which alliances pursued, and which investments would best serve the city's long-term interests. The fusion of commerce, politics, and religion created a system where wealth was not only material but symbolic, a tool for influence that could be leveraged to shape loyalty, maintain order, and project power across the region. Trade routes were dangerous, and merchants faced threats from bandits, rival kingdoms, and treacherous terrain. Caravans were often armed, escorted by soldiers trained to defend goods and protect lives. Yet risk itself was a currency. Those who could navigate the perils of distance, climate, and conflict often returned with extraordinary profits. These journeys were more than commerce. They were explorations into a world where strategy, courage, and negotiation intersected. Knowledge gained on these routes was as valuable as the goods themselves, providing Ashur's leaders with intelligence about foreign lands, political dynamics, and potential threats or opportunities. The city's coffers also fueled culture and innovation. Artisans crafted intricate jewelry, ceremonial objects, and weaponry, blending functionality with aesthetic brilliance. Skilled scribes recorded transactions, treaties, and events with meticulous precision, preserving a historical record that continues to fascinate scholars today. Even architecture and urban planning reflected the city's economic and political ambitions. Canals, roads, granaries, and marketplaces were designed to serve both practical and symbolic purposes, asserting Ashur's dominance while facilitating commerce. The city itself became a statement. Wealth was power, and power demanded visibility, structure, and control. Yet behind the glitter of trade and prosperity, there existed tension. Economic power could breed envy, discontent, and rebellion. Rival merchants, both within the city and across borders, sought to undermine Ashur's dominance. Neighboring states plotted to intercept caravans or monopolize resources. Internal unrest could erupt if wealth was perceived as concentrated in the hands of a few or if taxes burdened the population excessively. The city's leaders were acutely aware that economic advantage was inseparable from political stability and social order. Every coin collected, Every trade negotiated, and every shipment monitored was a step in a delicate dance to preserve dominance and prevent disruption. Ashur's economic influence was also a tool of diplomacy. By controlling access to rare goods and essential commodities, the city could negotiate alliances, secure loyalty, and manipulate rivals. Gifts of precious metals, exotic timber, and fine textiles were offered to kings and generals far beyond the Tigris, a language of influence that transcended borders. Merchants often acted as envoys, carrying not only goods but also messages, intelligence, and subtle political signals. In this way, commerce became inseparable from the exercise of power, and wealth became both shield and sword. Trade was, in many ways, the lifeblood of Ashur's Shadow Empire. It provided sustenance, funded armies, and created networks of influence that extended far beyond the city. Yet it also created vulnerabilities, requiring constant oversight, vigilance, and adaptability. Merchants were both assets and potential threats. Trade routes could be exploited by rivals. Wealth could inspire both loyalty and rebellion. The city's leaders understood that economic power was never static. It had to be actively managed, protected, and strategically deployed. Despite these challenges, Ashur's prosperity endured. Its markets thrived. Its trade routes extended farther than most contemporaneous city-states could imagine, and its coffers swelled with the products of human ingenuity and natural resources. Wealth became a symbol of divine favor, a reflection of the city's connection to its gods, and a measure of the ruler's competence. Success in trade and economics reinforced the perception of inevitability that permeated every aspect of Ashurian life, that the city was destined to endure, dominate, and shape history. In this intricate web of commerce, diplomacy, and strategy, Ashur became more than a city-state. It became a hub of influence and control. The wealth that flowed through its streets and markets did more than enrich its people. It created networks of loyalty, dependency, and psychological leverage that amplified the city's power. Merchants, priests, generals, and kings all played a part in this system, consciously or unconsciously shaping the destiny of the kingdom and its shadow empire. And beneath it all, the city's prosperity whispered a promise that those who understood the subtle interplay of wealth, influence, and faith could command a force far greater than any army, a power that extended across rivers, borders, and generations. Even as Ashur's markets thrived and its armies patrolled the fertile plains of Mesopotamia, a darker, less visible power pulsed through the city, the secretive world of intelligence, espionage, and covert strategy. The city's rulers understood that survival and dominance depended as much on what remained unseen as on what was displayed in walls, temples, or marketplaces. Information was as valuable as gold, and those who controlled it could influence kings, generals, and citizens alike without ever lifting a sword. Spies moved quietly along trade routes, infiltrating rival cities, listening to whispered conversations in foreign courts, and reporting every fragment of intelligence back to Ashur's shadow network. In a city where perception often dictated reality, espionage became not just a tool of war but a currency of power. The intelligence network of Ashur operated on multiple levels. Street informants kept an eye on markets, taverns, and neighborhoods, noting unusual activity or potential dissent. Merchants and travelers often unwittingly served as carriers of vital information, conveying knowledge about distant lands, military movements, and political alliances. Even within the royal court, informants and secret advisors monitored rivals, subtlety ensuring that no threat went unnoticed. Loyalty was bought, fear was cultivated, and knowledge became a weapon capable of altering the fates of nations. The city's spies were masters of disguise and deception. Some masqueraded as ordinary traders, blending seamlessly into caravans, while others assumed the roles of priests, scribes, or servants within foreign courts. Their reports were often coded in clay tablets, using symbols and phrases intelligible only to Ashur's ruling council. Through these methods, the city maintained a level of situational awareness that rivaled its armies in importance. By the time a neighboring ruler realized that Ashur had gained insight into their plans, it was often too late. The city had already acted, using diplomacy, trade restrictions, or military maneuvers to preemptively secure its advantage. Espionage in Ashur was not merely reactive. It was proactive and highly strategic. Kings and advisors studied intelligence to anticipate rival ambitions, predict rebellions, and even manipulate outcomes in distant lands. Disinformation campaigns were common. False messages, misleading gifts, and staged events designed to confuse or intimidate enemies. Ashur's ability to manipulate perception on a grand scale often allowed the city to achieve objectives without direct conflict, proving that war could be won as effectively through knowledge as through force. Yet this shadow world carried enormous risks. A single misstep, a spy discovered, a message intercepted, or a coded communication misunderstood, could have catastrophic consequences. The city's survival demanded precision, discipline, and constant vigilance. Agents who failed in their missions often faced death, while those who excelled were rewarded with influence, wealth, and the rare favor of the king. Life within this hidden system was a continuous test of loyalty, cunning, and courage, a deadly game in which the stakes were nothing less than the future of the city itself. Ashur's intelligence network also served to maintain internal stability. Rebel factions, disloyal generals, and ambitious nobles were constantly monitored. Rumors were intercepted before they could ignite uprisings, and dissension was carefully managed, often through subtle intimidation rather than overt punishment. In this way, espionage functioned not just as a means of expansion and protection, but as a mechanism for preserving the city's internal cohesion. Knowledge became both shield and sword, safeguarding Ashur from dangers both external and internal. The city's ability to project power through intelligence extended even into matters of faith and ritual. Priests, deeply embedded in the intelligence network, could subtly guide religious interpretation to support the king's agenda or undermine rivals. Omens and prophecies could be emphasized or ignored depending on political needs, allowing the rulers to act with the aura of divine inevitability. Even seemingly mundane rituals were leveraged as instruments of influence, reinforcing loyalty and shaping perceptions in ways invisible to most citizens. In Ashur, religion, politics, and espionage were intertwined, forming a triad of control that sustained the city's dominance. One of the most remarkable features of Ashur's intelligence apparatus was its long-term vision. The city strategists were not content with merely reacting to events. They planned decades ahead, predicting shifts in regional power, environmental challenges, and potential rebellions. Knowledge was accumulated meticulously. Records of past conflicts, patterns of trade, and genealogies of rival rulers all informed decisions that would shape the city's future. Every piece of information, no matter how minor, was valued for its potential to influence events and secure advantage. The psychological dimension of espionage was equally critical. By controlling the flow of information, Ashur's rulers could manipulate the perceptions of allies and enemies alike. A message delivered at the right moment could sow doubt, fear, or compliance. A rumor, carefully planted, could destabilize a rival or consolidate loyalty at home. Intelligence was thus not only a defensive tool but an offensive weapon, capable of shaping the decisions of others without the city ever engaging in direct confrontation. The unseen hand of Ashur guided events, often leaving adversaries wondering if they were truly free to act or merely pawns in a larger game. Despite its sophistication, Ashur's intelligence network relied on human skill, courage, and judgment. Spies had to navigate danger, deception, and shifting loyalties with precision. Couriers carried sensitive messages across vast distances, risking capture and execution. Analysts interpreted incomplete, sometimes contradictory reports to make decisions that could alter the fate of the kingdom. Every layer of the system required discipline and expertise, and the consequences of failure were severe. In this environment, brilliance and audacity were rewarded, but even the cleverest agent faced constant peril. The impact of this hidden machinery was profound. Wars were anticipated and countered before they fully materialized. Alliances were manipulated, rebellions suppressed, and rival cities kept off balance. Ashur's power extended far beyond what could be measured by walls, armies, or wealth alone. Its intelligence system allowed the city to operate with foresight, precision, and subtlety, creating an advantage that few contemporaries could match and even fewer fully understood. Ultimately, the secret network of Ashur reveals a fundamental truth about the city. Power is not only what is seen, it is also what is hidden. Walls, temples, armies, and markets were all essential, but the unseen architecture of spies, informants, and advisors ensured that the city could endure, dominate, and influence the course of history in ways that were invisible to outsiders. Ashur thrived in the shadows, manipulating perception, controlling knowledge, and shaping events in silence, proving that the most formidable forces are often those that remain unseen. The intelligence system of Ashur was more than a tool, it was a philosophy. It embodied the city's understanding of human nature, of ambition, fear, and loyalty, and it wove these elements into a framework that sustained an empire long before the rise of empires elsewhere. In the quiet corridors, hidden chambers, and silent streets of the city, the future was being written, one secret at a time. The power of Ashur was never merely in its armies or wealth. It was in its knowledge, its foresight, and its mastery of the invisible, a shadow empire that reached far beyond what the eye could see. Ashur's influence extended far beyond its walls, reaching across mountains, rivers, and deserts, touching lives and cities the rulers had never personally seen. Trade, diplomacy, war, and espionage were all threads woven into a vast network of control. But perhaps the most remarkable aspect of the city's reach was its ability to shape the minds and hearts of those it touched. The shadow of Ashur was not merely physical. It was psychological, cultural, and spiritual, and it often reached into places where soldiers could not tread. Its influence depended not only on coercion or wealth but on the careful crafting of perception, the subtle manipulation of belief, and the projection of inevitability. From the fertile plains of Mesopotamia to the rugged highlands beyond, rulers and commoners alike felt the weight of Ashur's presence. Envoys carried messages, gifts, and threats, and every interaction reinforced the city's authority. Neighboring kings knew that their decisions were often anticipated, that alliances could shift before they had time to act, and that any sign of weakness might be exploited. Ashur had mastered the art of psychological dominance, creating a sense of inevitability that left rivals questioning not only their power but the very structure of the world they inhabited. To resist was not just dangerous, it was often unthinkable. The city's cultural influence was equally potent. Art, architecture, and religion were tools carefully wielded to project power. Temples, statues, and monumental inscriptions broadcast the glory of the kings and the favor of the gods, creating symbols that communicated authority even to those who could not read. The imagery of winged bulls, lions, and celestial motifs served as constant reminders that Ashur's rulers were not ordinary men, but agents of divine will. These symbols were psychological instruments designed to instill awe, obedience, and fear. To encounter them was to be reminded that the city's power was not contingent on physical might alone. It was sanctioned by the cosmos itself. Even rituals and festivals carried a hidden weight. Public ceremonies were choreographed displays of loyalty and divine sanction, ensuring that citizens internalized the hierarchy and the king's supreme authority. Priests played dual roles, simultaneously guiding spiritual life and reinforcing political control. Every prayer, sacrifice, and festival reinforced the perception that Ashur was favored by the gods, and that its rulers acted as their instruments on earth. This fusion of religion and statecraft allowed the city to command loyalty and obedience without needing to resort to overt coercion, creating a population that believed in the inevitability of its rulers' dominance. Ashur's reach was not limited to loyalty and awe. It was also a system of influence that relied on fear and intimidation. Tales of conquered cities, recorded in inscriptions and reliefs, circulated far beyond the Tigris. They described massacres, deportations, and the fates of those who dared to resist. These accounts were not merely historical records. They were warnings, psychological weapons designed to ensure compliance without the need for constant warfare. Enemies could see what happened to those who defied Ashur and understand that resistance was futile, while allies knew that loyalty brought reward and protection. Through storytelling, propaganda, and visible examples of power, Ashur extended its control across vast distances, ensuring that its presence was felt even where it was not physically seen. The intelligence network amplified this psychological influence. Reports from spies and informants allowed the city to anticipate rival movements, sow discord among enemies, and manipulate perceptions to its advantage. Envoys and merchants unknowingly became instruments of strategy, spreading both information and subtle signals that reinforced Ashur's dominance. By controlling the flow of knowledge, the city shaped the decisions of rulers, generals, and citizens alike. Even distant regions felt the unseen hand of Ashur guiding events, whether through trade restrictions, political maneuvering, or the strategic use of fear. Its power was as much in what it revealed as in what it concealed. Ashur also understood the importance of loyalty in extending influence. Conquered territories were integrated into the empire through a combination of coercion, incentives, and cultural assimilation. Local rulers were often allowed to maintain nominal authority, provided they pledged allegiance, paid tribute, and reinforced Ashurian practices and rituals. This approach minimized rebellion while creating a network of dependent leaders who acted as extensions of the city's power. The rulers of Ashur demonstrated a keen understanding of human nature. People are more likely to obey if they feel their survival, prosperity, or status depends on it. Through a careful mix of reward and threat, Ashur created a system where loyalty became both a practical necessity and a psychological imperative. Trade played a critical role in this system of influence. Merchants, acting as intermediaries, carried not only goods but ideas, cultural practices, and symbols of authority. A shipment of rare timber or metal was not simply commerce. It was a tangible expression of Ashur's reach and control. Cities that depended on the flow of these commodities became linked to Ashur's fortunes, and their rulers were forced to consider the city's power when making decisions. Trade routes, caravans, and markets became conduits for influence, extending the city's presence far beyond its immediate borders and binding distant regions into its sphere of control. Even beyond political and economic dominance, Ashur's influence had a psychological dimension that shaped perceptions of history and destiny. Kings and generals in surrounding regions began to act as if Ashur's rise were inevitable, often making choices intended to placate or anticipate the city's moves rather than challenge them. This sense of inevitability was a hallmark of Ashur's strategy. By projecting strength, control, and divine favor, the city created an environment where others believed that resisting its will was futile. Its power was reinforced not only through action but through perception, and the psychological weight of this perception could be as decisive as any army. Yet, for all its outward confidence and control, Ashur's influence was a delicate balance. Maintaining dominance required constant vigilance, adaptation, and subtlety. Rival states could still unite, envoys could be bribed, and spies could betray. The city's reputation, while formidable, could falter if perceived weaknesses emerged. This awareness drove Ashur's rulers and advisors to operate with foresight, discipline, and cunning, ensuring that its influence remained both pervasive and resilient. The city's power depended on its ability to adapt and maintain control over perception, a task as complex and demanding as any military campaign. In the end, Ashur's reach was as much about the mind as it was about territory. Its rulers, advisors, and spies understood that dominance extended beyond armies, wealth, or walls. It was the manipulation of perception, the cultivation of awe and fear, and the orchestration of belief that allowed the city to project power across distances and generations. Its Shadow Empire was invisible, yet its effects were undeniable, shaping the politics, culture, and psychology of a region long before modern empires could claim such mastery. To confront Ashur was to face not only its armies but the full weight of its influence, the psychological, cultural, and spiritual power that permeated every interaction. Even in regions untouched by war, the city's presence was felt, its shadow guiding decisions, alliances, and ambitions. Its legacy endures not merely in ruins or inscriptions, but in the demonstration of a profound truth, that the most formidable empire is often the one that controls what others believe, shaping their minds long before they set foot on the battlefield. Even as Ashur's influence radiated across distant lands, its rulers knew that real power was not sustained solely by armies, trade, or spies. It demanded mastery over belief itself. Religion in Ashur was far more than devotion or ritual. It was a meticulously engineered system that intertwined faith, politics, and the very identity of the kingdom. The god Ashur was not merely a figure of worship. He was the embodiment of the city's destiny, a symbol of its strength, inevitability, and divine sanction. By aligning themselves with this deity, the kings projected an aura of inevitability, convincing citizens, allies, and enemies alike that the city's dominance was not just possible, but ordained. The temples of Ashur were not just sacred spaces. They were instruments of influence. Priests interpreted omens, conducted rituals, and maintained records of divine favor or divine displeasure that guided decisions at every level of governance. Kings sought the counsel of these religious authorities not only to demonstrate piety but to reinforce their legitimacy. Public ceremonies were carefully choreographed displays of devotion, combining spectacle, ritual, and symbolism to strengthen loyalty and awe. Every procession, sacrifice, and festival was a reminder that the king ruled not by personal ambition alone, but by divine will, an idea that instilled obedience and a sense of cosmic order. Yet religion was more than spectacle. It was a psychological weapon. By controlling the narrative of divine favor, Ashur's rulers could justify war, subjugation, and punishment while portraying themselves as instruments of justice rather than agents of cruelty. Enemies could be cast as impious, rebels as blasphemous, and conquered peoples as chosen for submission by the gods themselves. In this way, religion shaped perception, providing moral and cosmic rationale for acts that might otherwise seem ruthless. Faith became inseparable from politics, and belief itself was weaponized to maintain the city's supremacy. Priests were far more than spiritual leaders. They were also strategists, advisors, and guardians of secrets. They controlled not only religious knowledge but the information that flowed through temples, often functioning as intermediaries in both diplomacy and espionage. Sacred texts, omens, and ritual records offered insights into neighboring kingdoms, seasonal cycles, and political alliances. By managing the interpretation of these messages, priests subtly guided decisions of rulers, generals, and administrators. The spiritual and the political were entwined in Ashur, creating a system where divine authority reinforced worldly power, and vice versa. The city's rulers understood that fear, awe, and loyalty were profoundly intertwined. Public punishments, ritualized battles, and displays of wealth and piety were not random. They were calculated acts designed to impress and intimidate. Citizens internalized the idea that the king was chosen by the gods, that his enemies were cursed, and that Ashur itself was a manifestation of divine favor. This careful cultivation of perception allowed rulers to wield authority that extended beyond the physical city, shaping minds and actions across the region. Power in Ashur was as much psychological as it was material. Even within the city, belief functioned as a stabilizing force. Temples were centers of community, providing guidance, education, and social cohesion. Festivals and rituals reinforced collective identity, ensuring that loyalty to the city and to its rulers became intertwined with spiritual devotion. Citizens were not simply subjects. They were participants in a narrative that linked their fates to the divine order and the city's destiny. This merging of faith and civic life created a society where obedience, participation, and ambition were guided by the sense that the gods themselves had chosen the course of history. Yet the interplay between religion and power was not always seamless. Priests, advisors, and kings occasionally clashed over interpretation, ritual, or divine messages, creating tension that could affect policy, war, and diplomacy. Rival factions sometimes exploited omens or religious prophecy to justify rebellion or assert authority. The subtlety of these dynamics meant that religion was not merely a tool, but also a terrain of negotiation, intrigue, and sometimes danger. Mastery of faith, therefore, required not only piety but political acumen, psychological insight, and an understanding of human nature. The god Ashur himself became a symbol that extended far beyond theology. Representations in art, inscriptions, and reliefs portrayed him as a figure of authority, might, and cosmic order. Lions, winged bulls, and celestial motifs were imbued with meaning, reinforcing the idea that the city and its rulers were protected, empowered, and inevitable. These symbols were more than artistic expression. They were a language of influence, shaping how citizens, neighbors, and rivals perceived the city's power. Even distant rulers who had never visited Ashur could encounter these images through trade, diplomacy, or reports, subtly reinforcing the perception that the city's authority was absolute and divinely sanctioned. The integration of religion into governance and strategy was particularly evident in times of war. Priests interpreted omens to guide military campaigns, deciding the most auspicious moments to march, attack, or negotiate. Soldiers marched not only under the banner of the king but with the conviction that they carried divine favor. Enemy defeats were framed as the judgment of the gods, consolidating loyalty at home while intimidating rivals. Religion became both shield and sword, a source of morale, strategy, and psychological dominance that extended Ashur's reach far beyond its walls. At the heart of this system was a profound understanding of human psychology. Ashur's rulers and priests knew that belief could motivate, constrain, and shape behavior in ways that mere threat or force could not. By linking power to divine sanction, they created a sense of inevitability and order, making rebellion feel dangerous not only physically but spiritually. Loyalty became a moral as well as political imperative, and obedience was reinforced through ritual, art, and storytelling. In this way, faith was inseparable from authority, and the city's domination became both a lived experience and a psychological reality. Yet religion also provided a subtle form of flexibility. Omens could be interpreted to justify both success and failure, allowing rulers to maintain credibility even in times of adversity. Public ceremonies could be adapted to reinforce loyalty or manipulate perception depending on circumstance. This adaptability ensured that the system of belief was robust, capable of guiding both citizens and rulers through crises while sustaining the perception of divine favor. Ashur's mastery of faith was therefore not static. It was dynamic, responsive, and deeply intertwined with the city's broader strategy of control. Ultimately, the fusion of religion, politics, and strategy reveals the true genius of Ashur's rulers. Their power was not merely coercive. It was psychological, symbolic, and deeply human. By mastering belief, the city could project authority across distances, shape loyalty, and create an aura of inevitability that few dared challenge. Ashur's Shadow Empire was therefore as much an empire of the mind and spirit as it was of land, wealth, and armies. In the end, the god Ashur and the city that bore his name were inseparable. One legitimized the other, and together they created a force that extended across time and space, shaping both the hearts and actions of those within the city and far beyond. To understand Ashur is to recognize that true power is never merely physical. It is the subtle, invisible mastery of perception, belief, and influence. In this, the city reached heights that few contemporaries could comprehend, leaving a legacy that would echo through history long after the mud-brick walls had crumbled. While Ashur's temples and religious institutions shaped belief, and its intelligence networks manipulated perception, the city's military remained the ultimate instrument of power, the visible hand that enforced the invisible empire. To outsiders, Ashur appeared invincible, a city-state whose armies moved with precision, terror, and purpose. Yet beneath this surface lay a system of training, organization, and psychological conditioning that transformed ordinary men into instruments of fear and obedience. From a young age, soldiers were immersed in a culture that fused discipline, ritual, and violence, ensuring that loyalty to the king and the city was absolute. Military training in Ashur was rigorous, unrelenting, and multifaceted. Boys and young men were instructed not only in the use of weapons but in strategy, reconnaissance, and psychological manipulation. They learned the terrain intimately, studied enemy tactics, and practiced siege techniques that were far ahead of their time. Archers, charioteers, and infantry were drilled to act in concert, their movements almost choreographed, while commanders trained in the art of anticipating the enemy's mind and exploiting weaknesses. Success in battle was not only a measure of physical skill but of intellect, adaptability, and the capacity to inspire fear. The armies themselves were an extension of Ashur's philosophy of power, calculated, relentless, and symbolic. Siege warfare became a signature of the city's campaigns, a method that combined ingenuity, intimidation, and brute force. Fortresses fell not merely through strength but through engineering, strategy, and psychological terror. Victories were meticulously documented on reliefs and inscriptions, portraying enemies as helpless, defeated, and subject to divine judgment. The message was unmistakable. Resistance to Ashur was not only futile but morally and spiritually wrong. In these moments, the lines between military conquest, propaganda, and ritual merged seamlessly. Ashur's generals were more than tacticians, they were orchestrators of fear. They understood that war was as much psychological as physical, that the sight of disciplined soldiers, the noise of chariots, and the calculated destruction of key targets could paralyze enemies before combat even began. Cities surrendered at the first hint of Ashurian arrival because the reputation of the army preceded it. Tales of merciless campaigns circulated widely, instilling dread that made resistance rare. The army's effectiveness lay not only in its weapons, but in its ability to project inevitability, creating a battlefield where enemies were already defeated before the first arrow flew. Yet the military was not merely a tool of aggression. It was an instrument of order. Within Ashur itself, soldiers acted as enforcers of law, protectors of trade routes, and guardians of infrastructure. Their presence ensured that markets functioned, caravans moved safely, and rebellions were suppressed before they could gain momentum. Military power was woven into the fabric of everyday life, a constant reminder that the city's authority was absolute and omnipresent. Obedience was not optional, and discipline was maintained through both fear and structured hierarchy. The psychological conditioning of soldiers extended beyond obedience to instill a sense of destiny. Ashurian warriors were taught that they served not only the king but the god Ashur, and that their actions in battle were part of a divine plan. Victory was seen as proof of divine favor. Defeat, when it occurred, as an opportunity for reflection and renewed discipline. This blend of spiritual belief and military training created soldiers who were both loyal and motivated, capable of extraordinary feats on the battlefield and unwavering in their service to the empire. Chariots, the pride of Ashur's army, were more than vehicles of war. They were symbols of power and technological ingenuity. Their speed, maneuverability, and impact in battle provided both practical and psychological advantages. A charge of chariots could shatter enemy lines, but it also sent a message of superiority, demonstrating the city's mastery over both terrain and technology. Soldiers operating these machines were elite, trained to act as extensions of the king's will, executing maneuvers that combined spectacle, efficiency, and terror. Siege engines, another hallmark of Ashurian warfare, demonstrated the city's innovation. Towers, battering rams, and complex machinery allowed the army to overcome fortifications that would have stopped lesser forces. These machines were often as much about display as function. The mere presence of a massive siege tower at a city wall could compel surrender, the enemy overwhelmed not only by technology but by the implications of Ashurian ingenuity. In this way, the army functioned as a theater of power, where victory was guaranteed not only by skill but by perception, intimidation, and careful planning. Yet Ashur's military success depended on more than equipment and strategy. It relied on cohesion, loyalty, and intelligence. Units communicated through signals, messengers, and prearranged codes, allowing for rapid coordination and adaptability. Spies fed information from the field into command decisions, ensuring that the army acted on knowledge as well as strength. Loyalty was reinforced through reward, ritual, and shared identity, creating a force that could operate with discipline even under extreme pressure. Soldiers were taught that failure was dishonor, not only to themselves but to the city, the king, and the god Ashur. The army's campaigns were often accompanied by propaganda designed to maximize psychological impact. Reliefs and inscriptions recorded not just the events of battle, but the suffering of enemies, emphasizing Ashur's might and divine favor. These depictions traveled far beyond the battlefield, reaching allies and adversaries alike, reinforcing the city's reputation and discouraging rebellion. Military action and messaging were inseparable. The outcome of a battle was as much about perception as it was about territory. Ashur's army was therefore a dual instrument, a force of conquest and a mechanism of influence, shaping reality both physically and psychologically. Even so, Ashur's reliance on military power was tempered by strategy and prudence. Leaders understood that overextension, internal dissent, or miscalculation could jeopardize even the most successful campaigns. Soldiers were deployed not just to fight but to secure infrastructure, protect trade, and enforce loyalty. War was an instrument, carefully calibrated to maintain and expand influence without destabilizing the core of the empire. The army's efficiency and discipline were reflections of a broader philosophy. Strength must be managed intelligently, wielded in service of strategy, perception, and the city's long-term survival. The human dimension of the army was profound. Soldiers were both feared and revered, bound by discipline, loyalty, and a shared sense of purpose. Families of warriors were invested in campaigns, communities supported recruitment and training, and every conquest became part of a collective narrative that celebrated courage, obedience, and divine favor. Through this integration of society and military, Ashur created an enduring culture of power, resilience, and psychological dominance that transcended generations. Ultimately, Ashur's military was more than a force of violence. It was a manifestation of the city's philosophy of control. Discipline, innovation, psychological strategy, and divine sanction combined to create a force that could impose order, expand influence, and intimidate adversaries without constant conflict. The army was a visible reflection of the city's invisible strengths, its intelligence, its faith, and its capacity to shape perception. To confront Ashur in battle was to face not only skill and steel but the weight of an empire that commanded obedience, fear, and awe at every level. In the end, the city's armies exemplified the fusion of strategy, psychology, and ritual that defined Ashur itself. The sword enforced the will of the king, the intelligence network guided its use, and the god Ashur sanctified its purpose. Victory was never accidental. It was the product of calculation, fear, and foresight, a testament to a civilization that understood that true dominance was as much about mind and spirit as it was about body and weapon. Ashur's Shadow Empire, therefore, was not only an empire of land and wealth. It was an empire of mastery, extending across the plains, hearts, and imaginations of all who fell within its reach. Despite its disciplined army, sprawling trade networks, and divine sanction, Ashur's greatest strength lay in its ability to assimilate conquered peoples, turning former enemies into loyal subjects. Conquest alone was never enough. The city understood that lasting power required integration, subtlety, and psychological sophistication. The rulers of Ashur wielded not only the sword but also culture, religion, and administration, transforming the conquered into participants in the empire's destiny. They recognized that loyalty was not enforced by fear alone, but nurtured through incentives, shared purpose, and the careful blending of traditions. In newly conquered territories, local rulers were often allowed to retain their positions, provided they acknowledged Ashur's supremacy. Tribute and obedience became symbols of both submission and survival, and through this system, the city extended its influence without expending resources on continuous occupation. Generals and administrators coordinated closely with these local leaders, ensuring that tax collection, resource management, and military recruitment all aligned with Ashurian interests. In effect, the conquered lands were woven into the empire's fabric, their autonomy limited but sufficient to maintain social cohesion and loyalty. Religion played a crucial role in assimilation. Temples and religious officials were often co-opted to reinforce the authority of Ashur's king and the god Ashur. Local deities were incorporated into the empire's pantheon, or their worship aligned with Ashurian principles. Festivals, rituals, and prayers were adapted to create a sense of unity under divine sanction, and priests became both spiritual guides and instruments of political influence. By merging belief systems, Ashur fostered loyalty that was as spiritual as it was practical, creating a population that internalized obedience and perceived it as both necessary and righteous. The integration process also relied on education, administration, and infrastructure. Assyrian scribes trained local elites in record-keeping, trade documentation, and legal administration, ensuring that the conquered territories could operate efficiently within the larger imperial framework. Roads, canals, and fortifications were built not only for military purposes, but to facilitate commerce, communication, and governance. By embedding Assyrian systems into daily life, the empire created a network of dependencies that bound conquered peoples to its fate, making rebellion difficult and costly. Trade, too, was a tool of assimilation. Local economies were redirected to serve the empire's interests, connecting previously independent cities to Ashur's broader network. Merchants from different regions interacted under the rules and protections of the empire, creating shared incentives and fostering a sense of collective identity. Goods, ideas, and information flowed along these routes, reinforcing loyalty and integrating disparate cultures. The city's economic policies were carefully calibrated to reward compliance, punish defiance, and ensure that prosperity was tied to allegiance to the empire. Yet assimilation was never simple or without tension. Cultural differences, rivalries, and the memory of conquest threatened stability. Ashur's administrators had to navigate these challenges delicately, balancing coercion with diplomacy, punishment with reward, and tradition with innovation. Every decision carried risk. An overly harsh approach could spark rebellion, while excessive leniency might undermine authority. This constant negotiation required intelligence, psychological insight, and a nuanced understanding of human behavior. The city's leaders cultivated networks of informants, loyalists, and advisors to monitor the pulse of each territory, ensuring that potential unrest was detected and managed before it could escalate. Military garrisons played a dual role in assimilation. They provided security and enforced obedience, but they also served as symbols of the city's presence and strength. Soldiers interacted with local populations, demonstrating the power of Ashur while also participating in infrastructure projects, trade protection, and civic organization. This constant, visible presence reinforced the perception that Ashur's authority was absolute, yet its integrationist policies ensured that the local population had a stake in the empire's success. Fear and loyalty, coercion and cooperation, operated in tandem to create a durable system of control. Marriage alliances and political partnerships further strengthened Ashur's hold on conquered territories. Royal families, nobles, and influential figures were often married into the Assyrian elite, creating personal and dynastic bonds that linked distant regions to the city. These alliances ensured loyalty, facilitated cultural exchange, and provided tangible incentives for collaboration. In this way, Ashur extended its influence through relationships as well as armies, embedding its authority within the very fabric of society. The assimilation strategy also relied on communication and symbolism. Monuments, inscriptions, and reliefs recorded both victories and acts of mercy, demonstrating the city's capacity for both power and benevolence. This careful narrative reinforced the idea that Ashur was just wise and divinely favored, encouraging conquered peoples to align their interests with those of the empire. Every public display, from religious ceremonies to military parades, was orchestrated to reinforce loyalty and instill a shared sense of destiny. Even in rebellion or unrest, Ashur's methods were subtle. Revolts were often contained quickly, with leaders executed or exiled while populations were offered incentives for renewed compliance. The city understood that punishment needed to be visible but not excessive, creating a balance between fear and pragmatism. By managing perception carefully, Ashur maintained authority while minimizing long-term resentment, ensuring that the empire remained resilient in the face of challenges. Education and culture were also tools of assimilation. Assyrian scribes, artisans, and teachers brought their knowledge to conquered territories, spreading literacy, craftsmanship, and bureaucratic expertise. Local elites were trained in Assyrian methods of governance, trade, and ritual, creating a class of intermediaries who could operate both within their communities and in alignment with the empire's objectives. Cultural integration reinforced loyalty, created shared values, and enabled the empire to function efficiently across diverse regions. In essence, Ashur's approach to assimilation was comprehensive and sophisticated. Military conquest was only the first step. Long-term control required the intertwining of administration, culture, religion, and psychology. By creating systems of loyalty, interdependence, and shared identity, the empire transformed subjugation into participation. Conquered peoples became stakeholders in Ashur's success, invested in the stability, prosperity, and destiny of the city. The empire's reach was therefore not just physical, but social, cultural, and psychological, embedding Ashur into the hearts and minds of those it governed. The city's ability to integrate diverse populations also ensured continuity across generations. Children in conquered territories learned Ashurian customs, language, and religious practices, internalizing the city's authority from a young age. Social structures, economic networks, and spiritual guidance reinforced this alignment, creating a population that not only obeyed but identified with the empire. In this way, Ashur built resilience that transcended the immediate aftermath of conquest, establishing a legacy that would endure long after the initial campaigns. Ultimately, Ashur's mastery of assimilation demonstrates the empire's sophisticated understanding of power. Strength was not only about armies, wealth, or divine sanction. It was about shaping human behavior, aligning interests, and creating networks of loyalty that extended far beyond the battlefield. The city's rulers recognized that empires endure not through coercion alone, but through integration, influence, and the subtle management of culture, religion, and society. Ashur's Shadow Empire, therefore, was as much an empire of the mind and spirit as it was of land and resources. Through conquest, assimilation, and cultural integration, Ashur created a model of imperial dominance that was both practical and psychological. The city's authority was embedded in the structures of daily life, reinforced through ritual, trade, education, and administration, and legitimized by religion. This multi-layered approach ensured that the empire's power was durable, pervasive, and largely uncontested. Even those who might have resisted were subtly woven into the fabric of Ashurian influence, ensuring that the shadow of the city extended across generations, regions, and hearts. Amid its military might, sprawling influence, and assimilation of conquered lands, Ashur's rulers recognized that the city's survival depended on more than just strategy or brute force. It relied on the mastery of logistics. In an empire stretching across rivers, plains, and deserts, the movement of armies, resources, and information required unprecedented organization. Roads, canals, and supply depots were not mere infrastructure. They were the veins and arteries of an empire, ensuring that Ashur could respond to threats, enforce control, and extend its reach across vast territories. Without these systems, the city's dominance would have been nothing more than ambition unchecked by practical capability. Ashurian roads were carefully planned and meticulously maintained. Stone-paved paths and leveled routes connected the city to distant outposts, towns, and trade hubs. Along these roads, way stations provided rest, food, and security for travelers and couriers alike. These logistical arteries allowed armies to march efficiently, merchants to move goods safely, and messengers to transmit information quickly. The speed and reliability of communication and transport gave Ashur a decisive advantage over rivals, enabling preemptive actions and coordinated campaigns that could overwhelm adversaries before they fully understood the city's intentions. Canals and waterways added another layer of logistical sophistication. Ashur was strategically positioned along the Tigris River, allowing for the movement of goods, troops, and messages with remarkable efficiency. Rivers were not only trade routes, they were lifelines for supply chains, linking the city's heart to its peripheries. Ships carried grain, timber, metals, and other resources essential to sustaining both the military and civilian population. Water management also supported agriculture, ensuring that food supplies could sustain a growing population and the demands of prolonged campaigns. The integration of river transport with roads created a network that extended Ashur's influence deep into the surrounding regions. The logistics of the army were particularly impressive. Siege engines, chariots, weapons, and provisions had to be transported across long distances, often under challenging conditions. Supply depots were strategically located along routes, stocked with rations, water, and spare equipment. Cavalry and infantry units coordinated with couriers to ensure that intelligence and orders moved without delay. This system of support allowed the army to operate far from the city for extended periods, maintain readiness, and react rapidly to changing circumstances. Success on the battlefield was therefore inseparable from mastery of logistics, a fact that Ashur's rulers exploited to devastating effect. Trade routes themselves were both an economic and logistical tool. Merchants traveling between cities, towns, and caravans became vital links in the empire's network, moving goods, messages, and sometimes even intelligence. Assyrian oversight of these routes ensured that the city maintained control over commerce, collected tribute, and monitored the movements of potential adversaries. Trade was both a source of wealth and a mechanism of control, embedding the city's influence into the daily lives of populations across the region. Economic dominance and logistical mastery were intertwined, each reinforcing the other. Food and resources were central to the empire's stability. Assyrian planners understood that a city's power depended on its ability to feed its people and armies, even during campaigns or periods of scarcity. Granaries were strategically located and meticulously managed, with surplus stocks accumulated to weather famine, conflict, or unexpected delays. Agriculture was organized, irrigation systems maintained, and trade networks ensured that essential goods reached both city and frontier. By controlling the flow of resources, Ashur could project authority, reward loyalty, and punish rebellion, making logistics a tool of both sustenance and political power. Communication systems were equally critical. Couriers and messengers carried letters, tablets, and decrees across the empire, often navigating hundreds of miles in a matter of days. Relay stations, signals, and encoded messages allowed information to move faster than armies themselves, giving Ashur an intelligence advantage that rivaled its military. Commanders could coordinate distant campaigns, governors could manage outposts, and the king could maintain oversight of the empire's farthest reaches. Control over information and resources created a feedback loop that reinforced the city's dominance, ensuring that decisions were informed, timely, and strategically advantageous. Assyrian engineers and administrators worked closely to ensure that logistical systems were resilient and adaptable. Roads were repaired, canals dredged, and supply depots stocked according to both seasonal cycles and anticipated military campaigns. Contingency plans accounted for natural disasters, enemy interference, and internal unrest. This level of planning and foresight transformed what might have been a vulnerable system into an unbreakable backbone for the empire. Every stone laid, every canal dug, and every storage vault stocked contributed to the city's power, making logistics itself an instrument of strategy and influence. Even the urban layout of Ashur reflected its logistical genius. The city was organized to facilitate the movement of troops, goods, and citizens efficiently. Streets were wide enough to accommodate military formations, public spaces were strategically placed for ceremonies and gatherings, and storage facilities were integrated into the urban plan to support both commerce and defense. The city's architecture, infrastructure, and urban planning were deeply intertwined with its imperial ambitions, demonstrating that Ashur's power was rooted as much in design as in force. In addition to physical infrastructure, Ashur employed sophisticated record-keeping to manage logistics. Clay tablets recorded inventories, trade transactions, military supplies, and resource allocations, creating a system of accountability that extended from the city center to the farthest frontier. This meticulous documentation allowed administrators to anticipate shortages, respond to crises, and optimize the allocation of resources. Knowledge, in this sense, was inseparable from logistics, providing the information needed to maintain efficiency, enforce control, and sustain the empire's reach. The human element was also critical. Couriers, engineers, administrators, and laborers all played indispensable roles in the empire's logistical network. Their skills, coordination, and dedication ensured that plans translated into reality. Soldiers relied on this system for survival, merchants depended on it for prosperity, and governors leveraged it to maintain control. Every link in the chain, no matter how invisible or unglamorous, contributed to Ashur's capacity to dominate, demonstrating that power was as much about organization and human ingenuity as it was about wealth, armies, or divine favor. This mastery of logistics gave Ashur an unparalleled ability to sustain campaigns, enforce loyalty, and expand influence. While rivals might overextend or falter under the strain of supply and communication, Ashur's empire moved with the precision of a single organism, its infrastructure and human networks functioning in harmony. Distance, geography, and scarcity became tools rather than obstacles, enabling the city to project power far beyond what raw military force alone could achieve. Ultimately, the logistics of Ashur reveal a civilization that understood the deep interconnection between strategy, organization, and perception. Roads, canals, granaries, and record-keeping were not neutral elements. They were instruments of control, designed to reinforce authority, enable rapid action, and sustain the empire across generations. The city's ability to coordinate armies, resources, and information was as much a testament to foresight and intelligence as to engineering skill, forming a backbone that underpinned every aspect of Ashur's Shadow Empire. In the end, logistics was more than support, it was power itself. The unseen networks of roads, rivers, supplies, and records allowed Ashur to act with precision, project influence across vast distances, and maintain the illusion of inevitability that had come to define the empire. Every victory, every conquered city, and every loyal subject owed as much to this infrastructure as to the swords, spies, or divine authority of the city. Ashur's empire endured because it was not merely a collection of armies or rituals. It was a living system of coordination, foresight, and human ingenuity that turned ambition into unstoppable reality. While Ashur's armies marched and its logistics pulsed like the veins of an empire, the city's greatest victories were often won in the quiet corridors of diplomacy. Assyrian rulers understood that power was not only enforced by force, fear, or faith. It could also be cultivated through cunning, negotiation, and manipulation. Envoys traveled between cities, kingdoms, and distant tribes, carrying not just messages but influence, promises, and subtle threats. Diplomacy became a battlefield of its own, where words, alliances, and perception could achieve what armies alone might fail to secure. Diplomatic missions were meticulously orchestrated. Envoys were selected not only for intelligence or negotiation skills, but for their ability to perform under pressure, interpret subtle cues, and convey the aura of Assyrian authority. Gifts, flattery, and calculated displays of wealth were common tools, each designed to reinforce the city's image as both benevolent and omnipotent. Treaties were often crafted to appear fair, while subtly binding allies and rivals to Ashur's will. Even seemingly minor agreements had long-term consequences, entangling distant rulers in networks of obligation and dependence. Alliances were a central feature of Ashur's diplomatic strategy. Neighboring states were approached not only as potential threats but as instruments of influence. Marriages between royal families, the exchange of hostages, and ceremonial honors were tools to solidify loyalty. Ashur's rulers demonstrated an acute awareness of human psychology, knowing that personal bonds, fear of dishonor, and hope for reward could manipulate decisions as effectively as a sword. Diplomacy, in this sense, was both art and science, a delicate balance of persuasion, intimidation, and opportunity. Intelligence gathering was inseparable from diplomacy. Envoys were trained to observe, report, and manipulate. Merchants and travelers often carried hidden messages, while rumors and misinformation spread strategically to destabilize rivals. A city-state's perceptions could be influenced long before Ashur's armies arrived, creating conditions favorable to conquest or compliance. The line between diplomat, spy, and propagandist blurred, illustrating that in Ashur's world, information was as lethal as any weapon. The psychological aspect of diplomacy was particularly sophisticated. Assyrian negotiators understood that perception often outweighed reality. They could exaggerate military strength, suggest inevitable success, or highlight divine favor to sway decisions. Rivals might capitulate not because the city's armies were at their gates, but because the idea of Ashur's dominance had been carefully cultivated in their minds. Fear, respect, and awe became strategic tools, and the reputation of the city became a weapon as powerful as any chariot or bow. Ashurian envoys were also skilled at exploiting rivalries. Neighboring states rarely existed in isolation. Political, familial, and economic tensions were rife. Envoys identified fractures, encouraged suspicion, and manipulated alliances to Ashur's advantage. By fostering distrust among potential adversaries, the city reduced the likelihood of unified opposition. Diplomacy became a form of preemptive warfare, a way to weaken enemies before they could organize, and to turn potential threats into allies or neutral parties. Trade agreements were another subtle instrument of influence. By controlling access to markets, rare goods, and vital resources, Ashur bound other cities and regions into dependency. Economic interdependence created both incentive and leverage. Those who relied on Ashurian markets or materials had reason to comply with the city's demands. Diplomacy and commerce were intertwined, demonstrating that the empire's reach extended beyond coercion into the everyday lives and decisions of distant peoples. Ceremonial displays were crucial in diplomacy. Envoys, gifts, and ambassadors were presented with pomp designed to impress and intimidate. Public audiences, feasts, and festivals were opportunities to project wealth, sophistication, and divine sanction. Every detail was calculated to reinforce Ashur's superiority while fostering the perception of generosity and justice. The interplay of spectacle and negotiation ensured that even reluctant allies were impressed, and that rivals were aware of the city's unmatched capacity for influence. Negotiation in Ashur was never purely transactional. It was also narrative-driven. Envoys and rulers carefully crafted stories of the city's past victories, divine favor, and strategic inevitability. This narrative framed Ashur not just as a political power, but as a force of destiny. Allies were encouraged to see themselves as part of a grand historical trajectory that culminated in the city's dominance, while enemies were made to feel that resistance was both dangerous and futile. Diplomacy, in this sense, was both manipulation and myth-making. Even internal diplomacy within the empire was critical. Governors, military commanders, and local leaders were constantly reminded of Ashurian authority through protocol, ceremonial recognition, and strategic communication. Loyalty was reinforced through rewards and punishments, creating a culture in which ambition and obedience were guided by a shared understanding of hierarchy and divine favor. The internal cohesion of the empire depended as much on psychological and ritualized diplomacy as it did on force, reflecting the sophistication of Ashurian governance. Ashur's use of negotiation and manipulation also extended to distant tribes and nomadic groups. Envoys navigated complex social structures, kinship networks, and cultural customs to secure alliances or prevent raids. Success required patience, cultural literacy, and strategic foresight. Even minor gestures, a gift of livestock, a carefully chosen phrase, or the timing of a visit, could tip the balance between loyalty and hostility. The empire's influence often spread silently through these networks, long before armies ever arrived, demonstrating that power could travel as effectively through respect and fear as through conquest. At times, diplomacy was deliberately ambiguous. Ashurian envoys could hint at threats or promises without committing to specifics, leaving rival leaders in a state of uncertainty. This uncertainty magnified the perception of Ashur's power. If one could never be certain of the city's next move, it became difficult to act decisively against it. Psychological tension, in this sense, was a weapon as potent as swords or siege engines. Rivals were often paralyzed, their decisions guided not by opportunity but by fear and anticipation. Even failed negotiations could serve a strategic purpose. A rebuffed envoy might return with intelligence, or the rejection itself could be used to justify subsequent campaigns. Every diplomatic encounter, successful or not, contributed to the empire's understanding of the political landscape and reinforced its ability to shape events. Diplomacy, like warfare, was iterative. Every interaction added layers of knowledge, leverage, and influence. Ultimately, Ashur's diplomatic mastery reveals the depth of its understanding of power. The city did not rely solely on armies, wealth, or religion. It cultivated influence, manipulated perception, and wove a complex web of interdependence. By the time an army was sent, the battlefield was often already prepared through negotiation, alliance, and psychological pressure. Ashur's dominance was as much about foresight and strategy as it was about strength, and the city's reputation was a weapon wielded as skillfully as its armies or priests. In the end, diplomacy allowed Ashur to extend its Shadow Empire across vast distances, turning potential adversaries into allies, neutralizing threats, and consolidating influence. It transformed conquest from a matter of force into an exercise of subtlety, intelligence, and perception. Through careful negotiation, manipulation, and orchestration, the city demonstrated that true power lies not only in what one can take by force, but in what one can shape through skill, foresight, and the human mind. Ashur's envoys were not merely messengers. They were architects of empire, weaving a network of influence that became nearly inseparable from the city's very identity. Even as diplomacy secured allies and armies enforced obedience, Ashur's rulers understood that information was the lifeblood of power. Intelligence, espionage, and covert operations formed a shadow network that extended across the empire and beyond, often operating invisibly yet shaping outcomes as decisively as any battlefield. Every conquest, every alliance, and every campaign was guided by knowledge carefully gathered, interpreted, and acted upon. In Ashur, ignorance was the enemy, and information the most lethal weapon of all. Spies were embedded throughout neighboring cities, rival kingdoms, and even within Ashur itself. Merchants, travelers, and envoys often carried hidden messages, while informants provided insight into political intrigues, troop movements, and economic vulnerabilities. The city's leaders understood that timely intelligence could prevent rebellion, secure trade, and ensure that military campaigns succeeded before opposition had time to organize. In this way, Ashur's Shadow Empire extended far beyond its walls, reaching into the very minds of those it sought to influence. The art of espionage in Ashur was sophisticated, blending observation, deception, and psychological insight. Agents were trained to gather information discreetly, interpret the behavior of allies and enemies, and report in ways that allowed rulers to act with precision. Information was carefully verified and cross-checked, preventing false reports from triggering unnecessary conflict. Intelligence was treated as both an instrument and a safeguard, a tool to enforce control and a shield against surprise. Assyrian success depended not only on knowing what others intended but on anticipating what they could not yet imagine. Networks of spies and informants operated with remarkable coordination. Couriers transported secret messages across vast distances, while coded tablets ensured that information remained secure from interception. Even the smallest details, a change in trade patterns, a rumor in a distant market, a minor rebellion, were scrutinized for significance. Ashur's rulers recognized that the smallest piece of knowledge could yield a decisive advantage, turning uncertainty into strategy and vulnerability into opportunity. In this system, information became power incarnate. Yet intelligence was more than mere data. It was a form of influence. Misinformation, rumor, and subtle manipulation were as important as fact. Envoys could exaggerate the city's strength, spread doubt among allies, or sow discord between rival leaders. Assyrian spies understood that perception often outweighed reality. By shaping what others believed, the city could shape their decisions without ever drawing a sword. This psychological dimension of intelligence ensured that Ashur's power extended far beyond its physical presence, reaching into the decisions, fears, and loyalties of distant rulers. Even within Ashur, surveillance was a critical tool of governance. Administrators, military officers, and local leaders were monitored to ensure loyalty, prevent corruption, and enforce discipline. Records of tribute, census data, and correspondence allowed rulers to maintain oversight and anticipate challenges. By integrating intelligence into daily administration, Ashur created a system in which information flowed seamlessly from the fringes of the empire to the king's court, forming a web of awareness that reinforced authority and control. The city's spies also excelled in strategic deception. False reports, staged events, and manipulated rumors were carefully deployed to mislead enemies, delay campaigns, or provoke miscalculations. The psychological impact of uncertainty often exceeded that of any battlefield defeat. Adversaries unsure of Ashur's intentions were hesitant, cautious, and vulnerable. In this sense, espionage was as much about controlling perception as it was about gathering facts, a weapon that extended the empire's influence silently and effectively. Ashurian intelligence was closely linked with military strategy. Campaigns were planned around the knowledge gathered by scouts, informants, and spies, allowing generals to exploit weaknesses, anticipate movements, and strike with precision. Siege targets, supply routes, and vulnerable cities were identified long before soldiers arrived, minimizing risk and maximizing efficiency. Knowledge shaped action, and action confirmed authority. The synergy of intelligence and force was a hallmark of Ashur's enduring dominance. Economic intelligence was another vital dimension. Traders and markets were monitored to detect shifts in wealth, production, or allegiance. Supply chains could be disrupted, trade embargoes imposed, or incentives offered to maintain loyalty. By controlling the flow of resources and understanding the economic landscape, Ashur ensured that both allies and enemies were dependent on its power, further entrenching the city's influence. The empire's shadow reached into the daily life of its neighbors, making obedience and cooperation not only strategic but practical. Religion and intelligence often intersected. Priests, who interpreted omens and maintained records, provided insights into both the natural world and human behavior. Omens could be used to justify campaigns, punish dissent, or reinforce the perception of divine favor, while records offered subtle indicators of unrest, political shifts, or social tension. By combining spiritual authority with intelligence gathering, Ashur reinforced both loyalty and fear, ensuring that knowledge and belief worked in tandem to sustain the empire's reach. The human cost of this intelligence network was significant. Spies risked exposure, betrayal, and death, operating in shadows where failure meant elimination. Yet their work was essential, forming the silent foundation upon which Ashur's visible power rested. Soldiers, envoys, and administrators all relied on the unseen network of knowledge, unaware of the invisible threads that guided decisions, anticipated threats, and shaped the empire's strategy. In this way, espionage became the hidden heartbeat of Ashur's Shadow Empire. Even deception within the empire itself served a strategic purpose. Internal rivalries, factional tensions, and bureaucratic competition were monitored and sometimes manipulated to maintain balance, encourage loyalty, or prevent accumulation of excessive power in any single individual. By observing and guiding internal dynamics, rulers ensured that the empire remained stable, resilient, and capable of rapid response to both internal and external threats. The line between governance and espionage was blurred, reflecting a sophisticated understanding of human behavior and power. Ultimately, Ashur's intelligence operations reveal a civilization that understood that power is as much about information as it is about force. Control of knowledge, manipulation of perception, and anticipation of events allowed the city to act with precision and foresight. Military victories, political alliances, and economic dominance were often predicated on the quiet work of spies and informants, making the city's reach far greater than its armies alone could explain. In Ashur, to know was to rule, and the mastery of intelligence became the cornerstone of enduring authority. The empire's shadow stretched across lands not because everyone had seen its armies, but because everyone had felt the consequences of its knowledge, through fear, expectation, and manipulation. Neighboring rulers adjusted their decisions, subjects remained obedient, and enemies hesitated, all influenced by the invisible hand of Ashurian intelligence. In this, the city demonstrated that domination could be achieved as effectively through shadows and whispers as through banners and swords. In the end, the legacy of Ashur's intelligence network is a testament to the city's unparalleled understanding of strategy, human behavior, and psychological warfare. By mastering both visible and invisible elements of power, Ashur secured an empire that extended not only across territories, but into minds, decisions, and perceptions. Knowledge became an instrument of empire, an unseen force that shaped history, determined fate, and ensured that Ashur's shadow would loom long after the mud brick walls had crumbled. Even as Ashur's armies marched and its intelligence network reached into every corner of the known world, the city's rulers understood that lasting power required mastery over not just bodies and information, but the very essence of belief. Religion in Ashur was more than spiritual practice. It was a carefully cultivated instrument of control, loyalty, and psychological dominance. Every ritual, prayer, and temple served a dual purpose, honoring the god Ashur and reinforcing the city's authority in the hearts and minds of its people. The divine and the political were inseparable, creating a system in which obedience was sanctified, dissent was framed as sacrilege, and loyalty became a moral imperative. The city's religious institutions were vast and meticulously organized. Priests were trained not only in the rituals of worship but in administration, record-keeping, and observation of omens. They were both spiritual guides and political instruments, mediating between the king, the population, and the divine. Temples served as centers of power, repositories of wealth, and nodes of influence, where decisions were made, intelligence gathered, and social cohesion enforced. The religious elite wielded authority that complemented the king's temporal power, ensuring that the empire's ideology was both pervasive and persuasive. Ashur's rulers recognized that the perception of divine favor could shape both internal loyalty and external influence. Military campaigns, diplomatic maneuvers, and territorial expansion were all framed within the context of the god Ashur's will. Victories were interpreted as signs of divine endorsement, while setbacks were explained through ritual atonement or corrective measures. By tying the city's success to the god's favor, rulers created a moral and spiritual framework in which obedience and allegiance were not only pragmatic but sacred. Religion thus became both shield and sword, inspiring devotion and deterring opposition. Rituals were public, elaborate, and deeply symbolic. Festivals, sacrifices, and processions were designed to awe participants, emphasizing the city's power, wealth, and connection to the divine. Citizens and visitors alike witnessed demonstrations of Assyrian authority through these ceremonies, which blended spectacle with messaging. Every chant, every offering, and every architectural element of the temples conveyed layers of meaning: the king's legitimacy, the god's supremacy, and the empire's invincibility. These rituals created an emotional resonance that reinforced loyalty and shaped perception on both personal and collective levels. Priests played a subtle but powerful role in education and moral guidance. Children learned the myths, laws, and ethical frameworks of Ashur through instruction in temples, internalizing the city's values from an early age. The stories of past kings, heroic victories, and divine intervention became part of the cultural fabric, reinforcing obedience, courage, and reverence for authority. By embedding ideology into the population's consciousness, the empire ensured that its values were transmitted across generations, sustaining loyalty even in distant provinces. Ashur's religious strategy extended beyond its borders. Conquered peoples were often integrated into the city's spiritual framework, with local deities incorporated into Ashurian worship or rituals adapted to align with the city's theology. This approach created a sense of inclusion while subtly asserting Ashur's dominance, transforming potential dissent into participation. Religious festivals, temples, and ceremonies served as both instruments of cultural assimilation and tools for political stability, merging the spiritual and temporal in a way that few rival powers could replicate. Omens, astrology, and divination were central to decision-making. Kings and generals consulted priests and soothsayers before campaigns, economic initiatives, or political negotiations. Natural phenomena, celestial events, and ritual signs were interpreted as guidance from Ashur, providing both justification and motivation. This blend of spiritual insight and practical strategy reinforced the perception that the city acted under divine mandate, legitimizing decisions and inspiring confidence among both rulers and subjects. Even the most skeptical could not ignore the powerful interplay of belief, ritual, and action that shaped the city's destiny. Sacrifice, both symbolic and literal, played a critical role in reinforcing authority. Offerings to the god Ashur were acts of devotion, displays of wealth, and demonstrations of obedience. Public rituals often involved processions, the presentation of spoils, or ceremonial acts that dramatize the connection between human action and divine will. By participating in these events, citizens, soldiers, and officials internalized the moral framework of the empire, binding themselves emotionally and spiritually to the city's survival and success. Obedience became not only civic duty but an act of piety. Temples also functioned as centers of intelligence and record-keeping. Priests observed social behavior, monitored correspondence, and maintained detailed records of trade, tribute, and population. This dual role, spiritual and administrative, allowed religion to reinforce governance, creating a seamless integration of power and belief. The god Ashur's presence was both moral and practical. Devotion justified authority, and authority ensured devotion. In this way, the spiritual and the temporal were fused into a cohesive system that extended across the empire. Even military campaigns were imbued with religious significance. Soldiers were often ritually blessed, offerings made before departure, and victories publicly celebrated as proof of divine favor. The belief that Ashur's soldiers fought not only for the king but for the god himself created motivation, discipline, and psychological resilience. Courage on the battlefield was intertwined with faith, making the army an instrument not only of strategy but of sacred duty. Fear of divine punishment for failure added another layer of control, ensuring that obedience and valor were inseparable from religious devotion. Religion also provided moral justification for conquest and punishment. Cities that resisted were framed as defiant not merely against the king but against the god Ashur, turning rebellion into sacrilege. Conversely, cooperation and submission were depicted as virtuous, aligning self-interest with divine will. This moral framing allowed the empire to act ruthlessly without undermining legitimacy, making fear, compliance, and participation emotionally and spiritually coherent. Assyrian power was therefore reinforced by ethics as much as by force, creating a society in which obedience was not only expedient but morally sanctioned. The architecture of Ashur's temples reflected both spiritual devotion and political sophistication. Massive structures, adorned with reliefs depicting kings, gods, and victories, dominated the urban landscape. Every wall, stairway, and gateway communicated the city's narrative: the king's divine mandate, the god's supremacy, and the empire's inevitable dominance. Pilgrims, citizens, and diplomats alike were confronted with these messages, internalizing Ashur's power visually and emotionally. Architecture became a silent messenger, embedding authority into the very spaces where life unfolded. Even at the individual level, religious practice reinforced identity and loyalty. Citizens learned their place within the empire through ritual, narrative, and community participation. Festivals and ceremonies were opportunities for collective experience, shaping emotional and social bonds that transcended personal ambition. Religious devotion became a form of social cohesion, ensuring that loyalty was embedded in the fabric of daily life. In this way, Ashur's ideology reached beyond elite circles, permeating every stratum of society. Ultimately, the integration of religion into governance, military, diplomacy, and daily life created an empire in which belief, fear, and duty were intertwined. The god Ashur was not only a spiritual figure but a legitimizing force, providing rationale for conquest, authority, and empire building. Devotion reinforced obedience. Obedience reinforced power. By controlling perception, belief, and ritual, Ashur's rulers ensured that the empire's reach extended beyond bricks and armies, into the hearts, minds, and souls of all who fell under its shadow. Religion in Ashur was the invisible scaffold upon which the empire was built. It shaped thought, guided action, and sanctified authority. The city's dominion was not just territorial or economic. It was psychological and spiritual, creating a society in which power, fear, and faith were inseparable. In this, Ashur's legacy as a shadow empire becomes clear. Control was total, influence pervasive, and obedience sanctified. Its rulers understood that true power is not only wielded with swords and strategy, but with belief, devotion, and the profound mastery of the human psyche. Even with armies, diplomacy, intelligence, and religion meticulously orchestrated, Ashur's rulers knew that the empire's lifeblood depended on wealth, vast, flowing, and carefully managed. The city understood that money was not just a medium of trade. It was a tool of control, a means to manipulate loyalty, and a weapon of influence. The collection, allocation, and redistribution of wealth underpinned every facet of the empire, from the construction of massive temples to the payment of soldiers, the financing of trade networks, and the rewards of loyalty. In Ashur, wealth was a mechanism of power, and those who controlled it wielded influence that extended far beyond the visible reach of armies. Tribute from conquered cities and territories formed the backbone of the empire's economy. Local rulers were required to send gold, silver, grain, and precious goods as a symbol of submission and acknowledgement of Ashur's supremacy. Tribute was not arbitrary. It was meticulously calculated to sustain the empire's infrastructure, military campaigns, and administrative functions. Yet the system was designed not only for extraction but for integration. By linking the prosperity of cities to their compliance, Ashur created incentives for obedience. Loyalty was profitable, and rebellion carried a tangible cost. Trade, both local and long-distance, was another pillar of Ashurian wealth. Caravans traversed deserts, rivers, and mountains, transporting timber, metals, textiles, and exotic goods from distant lands. Merchants operated under Ashurian oversight, paying taxes and tolls, but also enjoying the protection of the empire's military and diplomatic networks. The empire controlled trade routes not just for economic gain, but as a means of influence. Cities reliant on Ashurian markets or materials were more likely to remain loyal, demonstrating how economic dominance reinforced political and military power. Ashur's rulers also recognized the psychological impact of wealth. Lavish palaces, monumental architecture, and glittering temples were not merely symbols of prosperity. They were instruments of awe and intimidation. Citizens, allies, and enemies alike were confronted with the visible proof of the city's resources, reinforcing the perception of invincibility. Wealth became a message, projecting the empire's reach and influence across every interaction. To witness Ashur's opulence was to understand, viscerally, the power of the city and the futility of resistance. Military campaigns were funded through this accumulation of wealth. Soldiers were paid, armies provisioned, and siege engines constructed from materials transported across the empire. Logistics, intelligence, and military strategy were inseparable from the city's economic power. Without resources, the armies would falter, the network of forts and garrisons would decay, and Ashur's dominance would be challenged. The management of wealth was therefore not an abstract exercise, but a vital instrument for maintaining control and projecting power across vast distances. The city's elite controlled and redistributed wealth with precision. Royalty, high-ranking officials, and priests managed the flow of resources to ensure loyalty and maintain influence. Gifts, rewards, and stipends were strategically allocated to secure allegiance, fund infrastructure, and incentivize behavior aligned with the empire's objectives. The economy was not left to chance. It was a tool of governance, deliberately structured to reinforce hierarchy, obedience, and social cohesion. Wealth became both carrot and stick, guiding behavior, rewarding compliance, and punishing dissent. Even ordinary citizens were tied into this system. Taxes, labor obligations, and participation in trade and religious activities created a complex web of dependence on the empire's economic structure. By linking prosperity, survival, and social standing to Ashurian authority, rulers ensured that loyalty was not simply enforced by fear, but reinforced by necessity and opportunity. Wealth, in this sense, became a mechanism of social engineering, shaping not only behavior but perception and aspiration. Ashur's financial strategies extended beyond immediate control to long-term investment. Construction projects, irrigation systems, and urban development were funded in ways that reinforced both economic stability and political power. By investing in infrastructure that benefited the population while serving imperial objectives, the city demonstrated foresight and strategic sophistication. Wealth was not squandered on mere display. It was a tool to consolidate influence, integrate conquered territories, and ensure the empire's durability across generations. The collection and use of tribute also served a symbolic purpose. Gold and silver, grain and goods, were reminders of the city's supremacy and the cost of submission. Conquered rulers and populations were constantly reminded of their dependency on Ashur, creating both psychological and material leverage. Economic obedience became a form of political loyalty, a subtle but powerful reinforcement of the empire's dominance. The system ensured that rebellion carried not only military risk but economic consequence, further intertwining wealth with control. Commerce also allowed Ashur to extend its cultural influence. Through trade, ideas, art, and technology traveled across the empire, fostering integration and shared identity. Wealth, in this sense, was not merely material. It was a vehicle for influence, shaping perceptions, tastes, and allegiances. Cities engaged in trade with Ashur absorbed not only goods but norms, expectations, and loyalties, further strengthening the empire's shadow reach. Economic integration became an invisible network binding the empire together as tightly as armies or roads. Assyrian finance also played a critical role in diplomacy. Gifts to allies, bribes to potential rivals, and payments for mercenary support were carefully managed to achieve maximum influence with minimal expenditure. Economic strategy became inseparable from political and military strategy, demonstrating that power was multidimensional. It could be projected through coins, grain, and gold just as effectively as through chariots or siege engines. The city's rulers understood that the perception of wealth alone could bend decisions, inspire cooperation, and deter opposition. Even the most mundane financial practices were infused with political and psychological significance. Markets, tariffs, and taxation were designed to reinforce obedience and dependence. Citizens and foreign traders alike learned that Ashur controlled not only territory but opportunity, creating a system in which every economic interaction was shaped by the city's authority. The empire's reach extended into everyday life, demonstrating that dominance was not just a matter of conquest but of structuring reality itself. The empire's economic power also enabled strategic generosity. Loans, gifts, and subsidies were deployed to stabilize regions, secure loyalty, or encourage cooperation. By controlling resources, Ashur could influence behavior without resorting to violence, demonstrating that power was as much about distribution as extraction. Then, with armies, diplomacy, intelligence, religion, and wealth carefully orchestrated, Ashur's rulers knew that the empire's survival depended on the loyalty and discipline of its most visible instrument of power, its military. The Assyrian army was not merely a collection of men with weapons. It was a complex, highly organized institution, built to project the city's authority across vast territories and inspire both awe and terror. The soldiers were the living embodiment of the empire's shadow, a force that extended its reach into the hearts of allies, subjects, and enemies alike. Training in the Assyrian army was rigorous and methodical. Soldiers were drilled in formations, weaponry, siegecraft, and strategy from an early age. Discipline was absolute. Obedience to commanders and the king was enforced with severe consequences for failure, while skill and bravery were rewarded with rank, wealth, and honor. The army functioned not just as a military unit but as a tool of social control, embedding loyalty into the psyche of its members and ensuring that the city's influence could be projected far beyond the walls of Ashur itself. The structure of the military was hierarchical and highly organized. Infantry, cavalry, chariot units, and siege engineers each had distinct roles, but coordination was paramount. Generals relied on precise intelligence, logistical planning, and communication networks to maneuver troops across difficult terrain, often spanning hundreds of miles. The ability to coordinate complex campaigns was a hallmark of Assyrian power, enabling the city to strike swiftly, overwhelm numerically superior enemies, and maintain pressure on distant regions. In this system, efficiency and adaptability were as crucial as bravery or skill. Siege warfare was a particular strength of Ashur's armies. Engineers and laborers constructed battering rams, towers, and fortification tools, allowing the city to conquer heavily fortified towns that might have resisted lesser powers. The psychological impact of these sieges was profound. Defenders, confronted with seemingly insurmountable technology and relentless pressure, often surrendered before the first breach. The Ashurian army understood that terror was a weapon as effective as steel, and the city's reputation for ruthless efficiency extended its influence without the need for constant combat. Chariot units were a symbol of Ashur's military sophistication. Swift, mobile, and heavily armed, these units could break enemy lines, pursue fleeing forces, or provide rapid reinforcement to critical points. Chariots required not only skilled drivers and warriors, but a supporting infrastructure of stables, blacksmiths, and supply lines. This coordination reflected the army's integration with logistics, demonstrating that mobility and power depended on careful planning as much as courage or strength. Chariots, in their speed and precision, became symbols of Ashurian dominance on the battlefield. The army's psychological impact extended beyond combat. Marching across regions, encamped in strategic locations, and demonstrating military might in public ceremonies, the Ashurian forces projected authority even in times of peace. Populations, aware of the army's discipline and effectiveness, often complied with Ashurian demands without resistance. The army was therefore both sword and spectacle, a tool of enforcement and a mechanism of intimidation. Fear, awe, and respect were cultivated as deliberately as any tactical maneuver. Training and loyalty were reinforced through reward and recognition. Soldiers who distinguished themselves in battle or service received promotion, land, or material rewards, tying personal ambition to imperial objectives. Those who faltered faced severe punishment, including execution or public humiliation. By linking personal gain to loyalty and performance, Ashurian commanders created a culture of discipline, pride, and obedience that permeated the ranks. The army was not only an instrument of conquest but a microcosm of the empire itself, reflecting the values, strategies, and hierarchies of the city it served. Mercenary forces supplemented the core army when necessary, extending the city's capacity without overextending its citizen soldiers. These troops were carefully integrated, paid, and supervised to prevent rebellion, while their expertise in specialized roles, archery, cavalry, or siegecraft, enhanced the army's flexibility. Ashur's use of mercenaries demonstrates a sophisticated understanding of resource management and strategic leverage. The empire could scale its power according to need, maintaining dominance without risking internal stability. Campaigns were meticulously planned, often months or years in advance. Commanders relied on intelligence to identify weak points, predict enemy movements, and allocate resources efficiently. Supply lines were secured, siege equipment prepared, and contingencies anticipated. The integration of logistics, intelligence, and military prowess allowed Ashur to execute operations with precision, often achieving victories that appeared almost inevitable. The army's success was therefore a combination of preparation, skill, and psychological warfare as much as brute strength. Even in defeat, Ashurian military strategy emphasized survival and recalibration. Retreats were orderly, intelligence was preserved, and lessons learned were immediately incorporated into planning. Failure was rarely catastrophic because the army's structure allowed rapid recovery and adaptation. This resilience reinforced the perception of invincibility, ensuring that the city's enemies approached conflict with caution and hesitation. The Ashurian army, like the empire itself, was designed to endure, adapt, and prevail over time. Religious rituals were deeply intertwined with military culture. Soldiers were often blessed by priests before campaigns, and victories were attributed to the god Ashur's favor. Rituals reinforced morale, obedience, and the belief that their actions were divinely sanctioned. The fusion of faith and force created a psychological bond between the individual soldier, the army, and the empire, transforming military service into both civic duty and spiritual obligation. Courage and loyalty became sacred acts, ensuring that Ashurian power extended beyond tactical maneuvers into the moral and emotional lives of its warriors. The army also served as a vehicle for social mobility. Exceptional soldiers could rise through the ranks, gaining status, wealth, and influence otherwise inaccessible. This created a personal stake in the empire's success, aligning individual ambition with imperial objectives. Meritocracy within the military reinforced competence, discipline, and loyalty, ensuring that the army remained effective even as it expanded. Personal ambition guided and channeled by the empire, became a stabilizing force rather than a threat. Campaigns were often accompanied by psychological terror intended to suppress resistance and encourage surrender. Cities faced with Ashurian forces were aware of the army's efficiency and ruthlessness. Stories of past sieges, public punishments, and overwhelming displays of force circulated far in advance, creating a climate of fear that often preempted battle. Ashur's mastery of intimidation demonstrates that power relied not only on military capability but on perception, manipulation, and the careful orchestration of reputation. Even governance in conquered territories relied on military integration. Garrisons were strategically positioned to enforce order, suppress rebellion, and facilitate tribute collection. Soldiers functioned as both enforcers and symbols, embodying the empire's presence and authority. Their role was not limited to combat. They were instruments of governance, policing, and cultural assimilation. Military power became inseparable from political stability, extending the empire's reach far beyond the battlefield. Ultimately, the Ashurian military was the visible manifestation of the empire's shadow. It was a disciplined, intelligent, and adaptive institution designed to project authority, enforce obedience, and inspire both fear and respect. Soldiers embodied the city's strategies, ideologies, and ambitions, ensuring that Ashur's influence was not merely territorial but psychological, moral, and cultural. The army was a living, breathing extension of the empire's will, an instrument of both protection and domination. In the end, the strength of Ashur's army reveals the sophistication of the empire itself. Power was never crude or arbitrary. It was calculated, integrated, and reinforced across multiple dimensions: strategy, logistics, intelligence, religion, wealth, and human psychology. The military was the apex of this system, translating abstract authority into action and consequence. Ashur's Shadow Empire endured not because of its walls or temples alone, but because it wielded its soldiers with precision, intelligence, and an understanding of human fear and ambition that few could match. Even as armies enforced order, spies gathered secrets, religion sanctified obedience, and wealth financed power, Ashur's rulers understood that the empire's ultimate strength relied on its ability to control information, not just through intelligence, but through narrative. History, memory, and storytelling were as carefully managed as tribute, trade, or chariot units. The city knew that the perception of events, victories, and even defeats could shape loyalty, fear, and ambition far more effectively than brute force. In Ashur, the stories told about the city were weapons, shaping the past, present, and future in ways no sword could replicate. From monumental inscriptions carved into temple walls to palace murals depicting kings and gods in eternal harmony, Ashurian rulers curated history. These images were not simple decoration. They were statements of power, legitimacy, and divine favor. Citizens, allies, and enemies alike absorbed these narratives, internalizing a version of reality carefully constructed to reinforce Ashurian dominance. The city's victories were immortalized. Defeats were minimized, rationalized, or omitted entirely. Memory became malleable, a tool in the hands of those who understood that what people believed often mattered more than what actually occurred. Scribes and chroniclers were the custodians of this narrative power. Trained to record events, create genealogies, and compose epic accounts, they ensured that every action of the king, every military campaign, and every diplomatic maneuver was interpreted within a framework of legitimacy and inevitability. Their work transformed individual deeds into part of a grand story, embedding Ashur's authority in collective consciousness. A single inscription, preserved for generations, could shape perception far more profoundly than an army ever could. Propaganda was subtle yet pervasive. Rituals, festivals, and public ceremonies reinforced stories of divine favor, military success, and moral authority. Citizens were reminded repeatedly of the empire's greatness, their own obligations, and the consequences of dissent. Even everyday life, markets, city walls, and public spaces, carried echoes of the narrative. Reliefs, statues, and symbols reminded all who passed that Ashur's power was absolute, sanctioned by both divine and human law. The city's story was everywhere, quietly guiding behavior, shaping loyalty, and instilling awe. The narrative extended beyond the city itself. Conquered regions were often incorporated into Ashur's story through local monuments, temple inscriptions, and controlled historical accounts. By presenting conquest as a natural and just consequence of the empire's power, Ashur minimized resistance and fostered a sense of inevitability. Even enemies, when confronted with these narratives, found their options constrained. Rebellion became not just dangerous, but conceptually illegitimate. The story of Ashur created a reality in which compliance was a rational, even moral, choice. Ashur's control of narrative also extended to memory and interpretation of defeat. Losses, setbacks, or failed campaigns were reframed as lessons sanctioned by divine will, opportunities for future triumph, or acts of resilience. By controlling how failure was remembered, the city preserved the image of invincibility while allowing room for adaptation and growth. This strategic manipulation of collective memory ensured that perception remained firmly under Ashur's control, even when events themselves threatened to undermine authority. Diplomacy and narrative intertwined. Envoys carried not just messages, but versions of events that cast Ashur favorably, emphasized inevitability, and subtly undermined rival morale. Intelligence gathered in the field was interpreted and presented in ways that strengthened the city's perceived supremacy. Foreign leaders, confronted with both the reality of Assyrian power and the curated story of its divine favor, often hesitated to resist, their decisions guided as much by belief and perception as by strategy or necessity. Narrative, in this sense, became a weapon of both internal and external influence. Religion reinforced narrative control. Priests interpreted omens, performed rituals, and told stories that connected the king's rule to divine mandate. The god Ashur's will was communicated through ritual, myth, and prophecy, ensuring that citizens and soldiers alike understood the empire's actions as part of a grand, preordained plan. In this way, belief, authority, and narrative were inseparable, forming a psychological architecture in which obedience, fear, and devotion reinforced one another. The story of the city became the story of the divine. Even the visual arts were harnessed to shape perception. Murals, reliefs, and sculptures depicted Assyrian victories, divine favor, and moral righteousness with dramatic flair. Scenes of conquered cities, obedient rulers, and heroic kings communicated power instantaneously, bypassing the need for complex explanation. These images carried the narrative into daily life, embedding it in memory, influencing behavior, and reinforcing loyalty. Art became both documentation and propaganda, immortalizing the empire's story in ways that survived the decay of wood, mud brick, and human lives. Education and instruction perpetuated the narrative across generations. Children were taught myths, historical accounts, and stories of the king's valor and divine favor. From an early age, citizens internalized a worldview in which Ashur's authority was natural, righteous, and unassailable. These lessons were reinforced through ritual, observation, and participation in civic life, ensuring that the empire's narrative became part of the social fabric. The city's story was therefore both top-down and deeply personal, guiding thought, emotion, and behavior. The Assyrian narrative also served strategic purposes in military contexts. Soldiers internalized the story of divine sanction and historical inevitability, giving them courage and discipline in the face of overwhelming odds. Enemies, confronted with tales of previous victories, terrifying sieges, and ruthless precision, often surrendered without contest. The perception of invincibility, carefully cultivated through narrative, extended the city's power far beyond the physical capabilities of its armies. History itself became an ally on the battlefield. Even economic control reinforced narrative. Tribute, taxes, and trade systems carried not only material wealth but implicit messages about the city's reach, authority, and inevitability. Populations came to understand their place within the empire not just through coercion, but through the stories embedded in economic obligation. Compliance became part of the city's story, a narrative reinforced daily by practical realities that echoed the myths, inscriptions, and rituals of Ashur. Ultimately, Ashur's mastery of narrative illustrates a civilization that understood power as multidimensional. Authority was not limited to walls, armies, or resources. It extended into perception, memory, and belief. By curating stories of victory, divine favor, and moral legitimacy, the city ensured that its influence endured in hearts and minds even when soldiers were far away or borders stretched thin. The empire's shadow was as much psychological as physical, as much about what people believed as what they feared. Even centuries later, the remnants of Ashur's narrative power survive. Inscriptions, artifacts, and ruins reveal a city that meticulously shaped perception, controlling memory, and projecting authority far beyond its walls. These stories remind us that power is rarely brute force alone. It is the skillful management of belief, perception, and collective memory. Ashur's empire endured because it controlled not only land and armies but the very stories that defined reality for those who lived within and beyond its reach. In the end, the lesson of Ashur's narrative mastery is clear. History is a tool of power, and those who shape it can dominate both present and future. By controlling the story, the city controlled minds, hearts, and decisions. The Shadow of Ashur was therefore not simply an empire of bricks, blood, and wealth. It was an empire of perception, of belief, of memory, and of inevitability, reaching far beyond the battlefield into the consciousness of every living soul within its orbit. The decline of Ashur did not arrive as a sudden collapse, but as a long, unsettling unwinding. The empire that had once commanded deserts, mountains, and rivers now found itself entangled in pressures it could no longer contain. Trade routes that had once flowed smoothly began to shift under the influence of rival powers. Wealth that once filled palaces and temples became thinner, stretched across too many fronts. The great cities, once engines of tribute and control, now demanded more than they provided. What truly shook the foundation of Ashur, however, was the growing fatigue of its people. Generations had lived under a system built upon relentless expansion. Conquest was not just strategy, it was survival. But when borders stopped growing, the machinery of empire began grinding against itself. The psychological aura of inevitability, so carefully cultivated over centuries, started to fade. Once the illusion cracked, the fears it had suppressed came flooding back. The neighbors of Ashur sensed opportunity. Emerging forces, once insignificant, began carving out influence. They challenged old treaties, disrupted trade, and supported rebellious tribes. The fringes of the empire became restless. Administrators struggled to hold territories together as loyalty grew conditional. Ashur still possessed brilliance. Its roads, its bureaucratic memory, its cultural reach. But brilliance without momentum becomes memory rather than force. Leaders attempted reforms, but the world around them was changing faster than their system allowed. The old strategies, terror, tribute, divine authority, no longer produced the same results. The empire was not yet dying, but it was undeniably dimming. And the shadows that had once belonged to Ashur alone now stretched equally toward its rivals, foreshadowing a future where the empire's dominance would no longer be a certainty, but a story of what once was, and what was slipping away. As Ashur's grip weakened, internal fractures began to deepen. The ruling elite, who once acted with unified purpose, found themselves divided over how to respond to the rapidly changing world. Some argued for renewed expansion, believing that only a bold military surge could restore the empire's aura. Others pushed for diplomacy, economic restructuring, or religious renewal. None of these visions aligned, and the result was paralysis. This indecision created an atmosphere of quiet dread. Citizens sensed that the center was no longer solid. Temples, once alive with confident rituals, now reflected uncertainty in their prayers. Merchants whispered of lost caravans. Soldiers questioned commands that no longer carried the steel-edged conviction of past generations. The empire's greatest strength had always been psychological unity. Now that unity had begun to splinter. Meanwhile, an unexpected transformation unfolded beyond Ashur's borders. The powers rising around it were not mere rivals. They were civilizations influenced by Ashur itself. They had adopted fragments of its administrative systems, its warfare techniques, its cultural expressions. In a strange, almost ironic twist, Ashur was being challenged by reflections of its own legacy. This emerging world no longer saw Ashur as an inevitable master. Instead, it viewed the empire like a giant slowed by age, still powerful but vulnerable. Even states that had once feared Ashur now prepared to confront it directly. The empire felt the pressure closing in, not through any single catastrophic event, but through countless small shifts. A lost ally, a disputed border, a failed harvest, a rebellion that spread further than expected. It was not collapse yet, but it was the unmistakable sensation of standing on a shoreline as the tide pulls back. Not violently, but steadily, revealing how much had quietly changed, and how close the next wave might be. As the final centuries of Ashur unfolded, the empire found itself caught in a slow-motion struggle between survival and inevitability. The world was no longer shaped by its commands. Instead, Ashur was adapting to forces beyond its control. It fought to preserve the appearance of strength, holding ceremonies, rebuilding walls, issuing decrees. But behind these gestures lay an uncomfortable truth. The empire was now reacting rather than directing. The territories once loyal by fear alone grew increasingly bold. Governors delayed tributes, local leaders negotiated directly with foreign powers, and generals in distant provinces acted as semi-independent rulers. Ashur's central authority thinned like parchment worn by time. Even the divine mandate, once the jewel of the empire's ideological power, seemed less convincing. When omens appeared unfavorable, the priest's explanations felt strained, uncertain, echoes rather than commands. External threats continued to rise. Rivals forged alliances, building networks strong enough to challenge even Ashur's hardened military traditions. Where Ashur once intimidated through psychological dominance, its enemies now advanced with confidence. Some sought conquest. Others sought to carve out influence in the vacuum Ashur's fading control had created. Yet even in this period of decline, Ashur demonstrated remarkable resilience. Its people adapted. Its administrators innovated small, practical solutions. Its cities still pulsed with trade, ritual, and memory. Decline did not erase identity, it refined it. In many ways, this era revealed the most human side of the empire. No longer an unstoppable force, Ashur became something more relatable. A civilization fighting to preserve meaning in a world it no longer commanded. And in that struggle lay the seed of its final legacy. A recognition that empire is not defined only by its rise, but by how it faces the moment when its shadow begins to withdraw. The final unraveling of Ashur began not with a grand invasion, but with a silence, an unsettling pause in the rhythms that had long defined the empire. Caravans grew fewer, emissaries arrived with troubling news, and the once predictable movements of neighbors became erratic. It felt as if the world itself were changing shape, tightening around Ashur like a slow, invisible grip. The empire tried to maintain its measured, authoritative stance, but beneath the surface, people sensed that the old order was slipping away. In distant provinces, local rulers tested their autonomy. Some withheld taxes. Others formed alliances that would once have been unthinkable. Ashur sent warnings, then envoys, and finally soldiers, but each action returned diluted, less decisive than before. The empire that had once demanded obedience now had to negotiate. It was a subtle shift, but a fatal one. When fear loses its edge, loyalty begins to crumble. Nature, too, seemed to conspire against the old power. The Tigris shifted its course in places, altering farmlands that had fed the empire for centuries. Seasons grew unpredictable. Even the sky, long a canvas for divine meaning, offered omens that felt ambiguous, open to interpretation rather than command. And yet, the people of Ashur did not surrender to despair. They rebuilt, reorganized, and tried to restore stability. Craftsmen continued their work, priests performed their rituals, and families passed down stories of an empire greater than any single generation. But the world around them was no longer shaped by their ancestors' confidence. Ashur had entered a stage where tradition itself became both shield and burden. The empire still stood, but its destiny was no longer in its own hands. What approached was not just conflict, but transformation, a turning point that would define what remained of Ashur's shadow. When the final great pressures converged upon Ashur, they did so with the weight of inevitability. Rivals who had once feared its armies now saw opportunity in its hesitation. Coalitions formed beyond the empire's borders, driven by ambition, revenge, or simple survival. Each faction sought to reshape the region in its own image, and Ashur, once the architect of order, found itself the target of a new, determined world rising from its edges. The campaigns that followed were fierce but strangely unbalanced. Ashur's warriors still fought with skill and discipline, yet the unity that once fueled them had thinned. Commanders disagreed, provinces delayed sending reinforcements, and the old psychological advantage was gone. Enemies advanced not with dread, but with momentum. Every victory they achieved echoed louder than the losses Ashur inflicted. Inside the capital, leaders debated desperately. Some argued that the gods had withdrawn their favor. Others insisted the empire could still recover if it adapted quickly enough. But adaptation in a system built on rigidity is slow, and the world outside was moving fast. As reports of lost territories reached the city, a quiet realization settled over its people. The era of Ashur's dominance was ending. Still, the fall was not chaos. It unfolded with the solemnity of something long foreseen. As cities changed hands and borders dissolved, a surprising resilience appeared among Ashur's people. They protected their knowledge, preserved their rituals, and safeguarded the stories that defined their identity. Even in surrender, they refused erasure. By the time the empire finally yielded, its physical power had faded, but its cultural spirit endured. The world that replaced Ashur was shaped, sometimes knowingly, sometimes unknowingly, by the very systems, symbols, and ideas the empire had refined. Long after the fall of Ashur, its shadow remained, as if the empire had carved its memory into the landscape itself. Travelers walking through the ruins felt a strange quiet, not of emptiness, but of something sleeping. Broken temples, half-buried walls, and scattered inscriptions whispered of a civilization that had sought not only to rule the world, but to define how the world understood power. Ashur's legacy survived in ways its kings could never have predicted. Ideas born in its courts and temples traveled far, carried by merchants, refugees, officials, and conquerors. Administrative systems, military strategies, religious symbols, and architectural styles appeared in successor states, often without acknowledgement of their origin. Ashur's influence became woven into the region's identity, subtle, pervasive, and enduring. Historians would later puzzle over how a fallen empire could echo so loudly across centuries. The answer lay not in its might, but in its understanding of the human mind. Ashur had mastered the art of shaping memory. It knew that power is preserved not only through force, but through story, ritual, and belief. Even its enemies inherited elements of its worldview, adapting them into their own. Thus, the empire's shadow stretched forward, long after its final walls crumbled. In this way, Ashur achieved a strange form of immortality. Not the immortality of continued rule, but the deeper kind, the kind that lingers in traditions, languages, symbols, and the invisible architecture of how societies think. Standing amid the remnants of its ancient heart, one realizes that Ashur's most lasting creation was not its empire, but its influence. It asks a silent question to anyone who listens. What endures longer, stone, power, or the ideas that outlive them both? Ashur's answer lives in its shadow, still stretching across history.